Most animals can feel pain, fear, separation, and loss. Yet their eyes do not begin to spill tears simply because emotion becomes too strong. Humans do something strangely different. In moments when words fail, the body releases a visible signal that blurs vision, exposes vulnerability, and seems almost useless for survival. Scientists can explain how tears are made, but not fully why emotion became tied to them. So why are humans the only animal known to cry emotional tears, and why can nobody fully explain why? Long before a tear could mean grief, relief, loneliness, or joy, tears already had a simpler job. The surface of the eye cannot function well when it is allowed to dry. Every time we blink, a thin film of fluid spreads across the front of the eye, helping keep that surface smooth, moist, and protected. It is part of the basic maintenance of vision. The fluid contains water, salts, oils, mucus, proteins, and other components that help stabilize the eye and defend it from irritation and microbes. In that sense, tears did not begin as a language of sadness. They began as part of the machinery required to keep a delicate sensory organ working. Other animals also produce tears or tear-like fluids for these basic purposes. Their eyes, like ours, must remain lubricated and protected from dust, injury, and drying. This matters because the mystery of human crying can easily be misunderstood. Humans are not unique because liquid comes from our eyes. The unusual feature is that strong emotion can cause visible tears to overflow even when there is no dust, smoke, wound, or obvious physical threat to the eye itself. Before we ask why, it helps to notice how ordinary the underlying system is. The glands that produce much of the watery portion of tears belong to a protective system that serves the eye whether a person is calm, frightened, grieving, or asleep. Blinking spreads the tear film. When irritation becomes strong, tear production can increase rapidly, washing the eye more aggressively. Anyone who has cut an onion, stood in smoke, or felt grit beneath an eyelid knows this reflex. The response is direct. Something irritates the eye, and fluid helps protect it. Emotional crying is different because the trigger can begin with an event that never touches the eye at all. A remembered voice, the death of someone loved, the return of a person long absent. Humiliation, helplessness, relief, or even music can lead to the same visible result. Tears gathering, vision becoming slightly blurred, and fluid moving down the face. The protective system of the eye has somehow become linked with states of the human mind. That connection is the true puzzle. We cannot see the moment when this connection first appeared in our evolutionary past. Tears leave no fossil trace, and soft tissues rarely preserve the history of how a nervous system once responded to emotion. We therefore have to be careful with any story that claims to know exactly when our ancestors first cried from grief or joy. Fossils can tell us about bones and bodies. Archaeology can reveal tools, food remains, shelters, movement, and sometimes evidence of social care. None of these can directly show whether a particular individual shed emotional tears. What we can say with confidence is more modest. The biological equipment for maintaining wet eyes is not uniquely human, while visible tearing in response to emotion is widely regarded as a distinctive human behavior. This difference turns an ordinary protective fluid into a question about the history of our species. At some stage in the human lineage, a system that served the eye became connected closely enough to emotion that inner states could sometimes appear on the face as water. That did not replace the older function. The same eyes still need lubrication, and the same tear system still responds to irritation. The emotional use, whatever its evolutionary history, rests on top of something more basic. If we assume that tears were created for grief, we miss the deeper sequence. First came the need to protect vision. Only later, somewhere in human history, did emotion begin using that existing pathway in a way that made private experience visible to other people. The origin of crying may therefore be not the origin of tears at all, but the origin of a new connection between an ancient bodily system and human emotional life. The human eye can become wet for several different reasons, and those reasons are easy to confuse because the result looks almost the same from the outside. A clear drop forms, the surface of the eye shines, and sometimes the liquid spills over the lower eyelid. Yet the biological meaning can be very different. One kind of tear is present almost all the time. It forms the thin tear film that keeps the surface of the eye moist, smooth, and optically clear. Without this constant layer, blinking would become uncomfortable, the cornea would be more vulnerable to damage, and vision itself could become less stable. These ordinary tears are so continuous that we rarely notice them. They do not arrive as an event. They are simply part of the background work of being a sighted animal with exposed eyes. Another kind appears when the eye encounters irritation. Smoke, dust, strong vapors, or a small particle can trigger a rapid increase in tearing. The purpose is straightforward. More fluid helps dilute or wash away the irritating substance. This reflex can be powerful enough to make a person look as if they are crying emotionally, even though sadness may be completely absent. The body is responding to a physical problem at the eye. The third situation is more difficult to explain. A person may be sitting in a quiet room with nothing touching the eye, yet tears begin to gather after hearing bad news. The same thing can happen after reunion. Relief, frustration, shame, tenderness, or an overwhelming memory. The eye itself is not injured. The air may be clean. No foreign object needs to be removed. The trigger begins somewhere in the nervous system as an emotional state, and the lacrimal system becomes involved. This is what makes emotional tearing unusual. It uses equipment that already has clear physical functions, but it recruits that equipment for a situation that is not primarily about protecting the eye. Scientists can describe many of the pathways involved in tear production and can study the brain and autonomic nervous system during emotional experiences, but describing a mechanism is not the same as explaining why evolution linked these systems in the first place. That distinction is important. We know how a gland can be stimulated. We know that emotion can alter breathing, heart rate, facial muscles, voice, posture, and many other bodily systems. What remains less certain is why visible tears became one of those responses in humans. The question becomes even more interesting when we look back toward human origins. Our ancestors did not begin with dry eyes and later invent tears. The protective functions of tear fluid are far older than our species. The evolutionary puzzle therefore concerns a modification of an existing system, not the appearance of a completely new organ. Somewhere in the history of the human lineage, emotional processes became connected strongly enough with tear production that internal states could sometimes produce a visible signal on the face. We cannot recover the exact moment when that happened, and there is no fossil that can record whether an ancient individual cried after loss, fear, or reunion. What survives are the biological systems we carry today and the social effects that tears can have on other people. That is why separating these different kinds of tearing matters. Baseline tears help the eye function. Reflex tears defend it from irritation. Emotional tears begin with something happening in the mind and body, rather than at the surface of the eye. All three use overlapping anatomy, but only one turns a hidden emotional state into something another person can see. This difference also prevents us from mistaking a familiar bodily response for a complete evolutionary explanation. The important distinction will follow us through the entire history of crying. The mystery is not why eyes make fluid. The mystery is why, in humans, emotion was allowed access to that fluid at all. A tear on the human face is such an ordinary sight that its strangeness is easy to miss. We see it in grief, relief, and moments when a person cannot explain what they are feeling. Yet from an evolutionary point of view, emotional tears present an unusual problem. Most changes in the body have consequences that are relatively easy to understand at a basic level. A pupil narrows in bright light. A hand pulls away from heat. Muscles tense when the body prepares to move. Reflex tears wash an irritated eye. Emotional tears are less obvious. The wetness alone explains nothing. They do not remove the memory that caused them. They do not repair the loss that may have preceded them. They can blur vision, change the voice, redden the eyes, and make a private emotional state visible to anyone nearby. None of this automatically tells us why such a response would have been retained during human evolution. The difficulty becomes clearer when we return to the beginning of the human story. Our ancestors inherited systems for sensing danger, regulating breathing, producing facial expressions, calling out, and maintaining the surface of the eyes. Natural selection did not have to create emotional communication from nothing. Long before modern humans existed, Social animals use sound, posture, movement, touch, and facial behavior to influence one another. A frightened infant could vocalize, an injured animal could withdraw or call. Members of a group could approach, avoid, protect, threaten, or comfort without needing visible tears. If those older channels already carried information, then emotional tearing seems at first like an unnecessary addition. This is where simple explanations become tempting. It is easy to say that humans cry because tears ask for help, because they reduce aggression, because they create social bonds, or because crying releases emotional pressure. Each idea may capture part of what happens in some situations, and several have been investigated scientifically, but none should be treated as a complete account of how the trait originated. A behavior can have several effects in the present without any one of those effects revealing the exact historical path by which it evolved. Evolution also does not design features toward a predetermined purpose. Existing structures can acquire new roles, and traits can persist through complicated combinations of biological and social consequences. Emotional tears may therefore be understood more carefully as a connection built upon older systems rather than as a device invented for a single task. The eye already produced fluid. The nervous system already responded to emotion. The face was already one of the most important surfaces through which humans read one another. At some point in our lineage, these systems became linked in the form we recognize today. But the evidence cannot show us the first individual in whom that connection appeared, or the circumstances in which it became useful. This missing history is not a failure of science. It is a limit imposed by the kind of phenomenon we are studying. Bones can fossilize, stone tools can survive, tears vanish within moments. Their evolutionary history must be approached through anatomy, physiology, development, behavior, species comparisons, and experiments on crying today. Each source gives a piece of the puzzle, but no single piece contains the origin story. That is why the wet human face deserves more attention than its familiarity suggests. Emotional crying sits at the boundary between an ancient bodily function and an unusually visible form of social emotion. It transforms something happening within the nervous system into a signal that another person may notice without being told anything. Whether that visibility was the crucial advantage, a secondary consequence, or only one element in a more complicated evolutionary process remains uncertain. Before asking what tears communicate, we first have to accept the deeper puzzle. Evolution connected emotion to the eyes, even though the eyes already had reasons of their own to make tears. Saying that humans are the only animals that cry sounds simple, but the sentence becomes misleading unless we define what crying means. Many animals produce tears because their eyes require moisture and protection, just as ours do. Mammals, birds, reptiles, and other animals possess different systems for keeping the surface of the eye healthy, although the exact composition and anatomy vary among species. An animal with wet eyes is therefore not automatically expressing sadness. At the same time, many animals clearly show distress through behaviors that humans readily recognize. Young mammals call when separated from their mothers. Social animals may vocalize after losing contact with companions. Frightened individuals can tremble, withdraw, struggle, become unusually quiet, or seek physical closeness. Some species alter their calls and behavior after the loss of another member of their group. None of this requires us to claim that their inner experience is identical to ours. It simply shows that suffering, arousal, separation responses, and social attachment did not begin with modern humans. The unusual human trait is narrower. Humans are the only species for which visible tears flowing from the eyes as a regular response to emotion are firmly established. That distinction matters because otherwise the question at the center of our story becomes distorted. The puzzle is not why other animals supposedly feel nothing strongly enough to cry. There is no scientific basis for such a conclusion. The puzzle is why the human nervous system links certain emotional states to increased tear production in a way that becomes visible on the face. Researchers have occasionally reported changes in tearing in non-human animals under emotionally significant circumstances, and some observations are scientifically interesting. But those findings do not yet demonstrate a widespread non-human equivalent of human emotional crying. It is safer to say that emotional tearing, as humans experience and recognize it, has not been established in other species. This careful wording becomes especially important when thinking about human origins. Our lineage emerged from animals that already possess systems for pain, fear, attachment, arousal, vocal communication, and eye protection. Early members of the human family did not suddenly acquire emotion when they became human, nor did social communication begin with tears. The foundations were already present in older mammalian biology. A dependent infant could signal discomfort with sound. A threatened individual could change posture. Members of a group could read movement, facial tension, proximity, and vocal tone. These channels could communicate urgent information long before anyone needed to notice moisture gathering beneath another person's eyes. Emotional tears must therefore be considered as one layer added to a much older communication landscape. This also prevents us from making another common mistake, assuming that crying has one universal meaning. Even among humans, tears are not a reliable translation of a single emotion. People cry from grief, pain, helplessness, frustration, reunion, relief, joy, tenderness, and experiences that combine several feelings at once. The same visible fluid can accompany very different internal states. What other people interpret from those tears depends on the face, the situation, the relationship, and the surrounding behavior. If we simply label tears as sadness, we lose much of what makes them biologically interesting. Human crying appears to take an old physical system and place it inside a complex social and emotional world. That world was built gradually through our evolutionary history, but tears themselves cannot tell us when the connection formed. They leave no archaeological trace. We cannot look at the skull of an ancient human relative and know whether that individual shed tears after separation or reunion. We can only compare living species, examine human development, study the nervous system, and observe how people respond when they see someone crying. Those lines of evidence allow cautious hypotheses, not a recovered scene from prehistory. The safest starting point is therefore neither that animals cry exactly as humans do, nor that animals never experience anything resembling the emotions surrounding human tears. Many animals possess tears. Many animals display distress. Humans appear unusual because emotional states can reliably recruit the tear system and turn an internal condition into something visible on the face. Once that distinction is clear, the question becomes much more precise. If nature already had voices, gestures, movement, and touch for communicating distress, what additional role could visible tears possibly have served? Long before human beings could speak, social animals already had ways to make distress visible and audible. A young mammal separated from its mother may call repeatedly. An injured animal may withdraw, change posture, move differently, or become unusually still. Fear can alter breathing, muscle tension, facial movement, and attention. In many species, these signals matter because survival depends on how nearby individuals respond. A parent may return to a calling infant. A group member may approach an injured companion. Another animal may keep its distance from an individual showing threat or agitation. None of these behaviors requires emotional tears. Nature already possessed a vocabulary of sound, movement, smell, touch, and facial expression before the human lineage developed its present form. This matters when we think about our own beginning. Human infants enter the world unusually dependent on care, but the problem of dependent young communicating need is much older than our species. Crying by voice is therefore not uniquely human in distress calling. Many young animals produce vocal signals when cold, hungry, isolated, frightened, or uncomfortable. These calls can change caregiver behavior even when no liquid is visible on the face. For an evolutionary explanation of human emotional tears, this creates a difficulty. If sound could already attract attention, why add a visual signal that works mainly when another individual is close enough to see the eyes? A scream can cross distance. Tears cannot. A call can continue in darkness. Tears lose much of their usefulness when the face cannot be seen. At first glance, visible crying seems like a weaker communication system than vocal distress. Yet weakness may be part of what makes it different. A loud call can announce urgency to everyone within hearing range, including individuals whose attention may be unwanted. A wet face is quieter. It can be noticed at close range without broadcasting the same information as far. This possibility has led researchers to consider whether tears may function partly within close social interaction, but it remains a hypothesis rather than a recovered fact about prehistoric life. We cannot know whether an early human ancestor benefited from crying quietly beside a caregiver, partner, or group member. What we can observe is that modern people respond to tears as social information, and that the response often depends on proximity, context, and relationship. The contrast between old distress signals and emotional tears shifts the question. Tears did not replace vocal crying, posture, touch, or facial expression. Humans still use all of them. A person in grief may cry out, become silent, cover the face, reach towards someone, or shed tears without making a sound. The systems overlap. That suggests emotional tearing may have become one additional channel within an already crowded network of communication, rather than a completely new language. Evolution often works with existing structures and behaviors in this way, modifying connections rather than starting from nothing. The eye already produced fluid. The face already carried social information. The nervous system already changed the body during intense emotion. A new link among these systems could create a signal that was physical and visible, but the existence of older signals prevents us from accepting an easy answer. If distress could already be heard, seen in posture, and felt through touch, then emotional tears were not necessary simply to announce that something was wrong. Their persistence suggests that they may have changed the quality of the message rather than merely repeating it. Perhaps they altered how vulnerability was perceived, how aggression was reduced, or how care was invited. Each possibility must be tested against evidence rather than treated as fact. The deeper mystery is therefore not how humans learn to communicate distress. Our animal relatives show that this ability has far older roots. The mystery is why, somewhere along the human line, distress and other powerful emotions gained access to the eyes and became visible as tears. If human ancestors already possessed voices, facial expressions, gestures, touch, and changes in posture, then emotional tears seem to arrive in a system that was already crowded with ways of communicating need. A frightened child could call. An injured person could become still or protective of a wounded limb. A separated individual could search, reach, or vocalize. These signals could be detected quickly, sometimes from a considerable distance. Tears appear less efficient by comparison. They are small, silent, and easily missed. Another person usually has to be close enough to see the face. Wind, rain, darkness, or simple distance can make them difficult to notice. If evolution had been trying only to produce the strongest possible alarm signal, visible tears would seem like a strange solution. But communication is not always about being louder. Sometimes the important question is not whether a signal can be detected, but what kind of response it creates in the person who detects it. Modern experiments provide an important clue here. When observers see tears on a human face, those tears can influence how they interpret the person's emotional state and how willing they feel to offer support. Removing visible tears from an otherwise similar face can change that judgment. Findings like these do not reveal exactly why emotional crying evolved, but they suggest that tears carry social information beyond the movement of facial muscles alone. A wet face may make vulnerability easier to recognize. It may indicate that an emotional state has crossed a threshold that ordinary speech or expression is no longer concealing. This possibility becomes especially interesting when considered against the social conditions that shaped the human lineage. Humans survive through unusually prolonged care of dependent young, repeated cooperation, food sharing, social learning, and relationships that could continue for years. We should not reconstruct specific prehistoric scenes as if we had observed them, but archaeological and comparative evidence supports the broader conclusion that social dependence has deep roots in human evolution. In such a world, accurately noticing the condition of another person could matter. Yet, even here, we must resist an easy conclusion. Tears may invite care in one setting and fail to do so in another. They may be interpreted as grief, pain, relief, sincerity, helplessness, or something less sympathetic depending on who is crying and who is watching. Human societies also teach people when tears are acceptable and when they should be hidden. A biological signal does not carry one fixed meaning independent of context. That flexibility may itself be important. Unlike a reflex response to smoke or dust, emotional crying is connected to many different experiences. People can cry after losing someone, after finding someone again, after enduring prolonged fear, after receiving unexpected kindness, or after tension finally ends. If tears had evolved only as a simple alarm for immediate danger, this wide range would be difficult to explain. Their significance may lie instead in communicating that a person's internal state has become unusually intense or difficult to regulate, while leaving the surrounding situation to tell others what that intensity means. This is still a hypothesis, not a settled evolutionary history. There is another difference between tears and louder distress signals. Vocal crying can demand attention. Visible tears can remain nearly silent. That may allow emotional information to be transmitted during close interaction without necessarily broadcasting it widely. Some researchers have proposed that this quieter form of signaling could have been useful in intimate social relationships, but no fossil or archaeological object can show us when such a function began. The first emotional tear disappeared as completely as every tear that followed it. We cannot identify the species, generation, or social circumstance in which the connection first became established. What survives is the modern human system and the effects it can have on people who observe it. This limitation changes how the question should be asked. Instead of searching for one dramatic moment when humans suddenly began to cry, it is more reasonable to imagine gradual changes in connections among older systems: tear production, emotional arousal, facial communication, attachment, and social attention. Natural selection can modify relationships among existing traits without producing an entirely new organ. The human eye did not need to evolve from the beginning for emotional crying to become possible. It already produced tears. The nervous system already responded to distress. The face already communicated information. What seems unusual is that these older systems became linked strongly enough for emotion to overflow visibly from the eyes. That still leaves the central problem intact. Tears may influence other people, but showing that they have social effects today does not prove which effect mattered most in their evolutionary past. The signal exists, the response can be measured, and the original reason remains beyond direct observation. A newborn enters the world without words, but not without a way to affect the people nearby. Long before language develops, crying can draw attention to discomfort, hunger, pain, fatigue, cold, separation, or a need that the infant cannot describe. The sound does not tell a caregiver exactly what is wrong, and no single cry has a simple meaning that can always be translated. Yet crying is difficult to ignore. It changes the behavior of adults, often bringing them closer, making them look, listen, touch, feed, hold, or examine the child. In this sense, the infant cry is one of the earliest communication signals in human life. It works before vocabulary, before intentional sentences, and before the child understands the social world in anything like an adult way. This matters for the history of emotional crying because the voice comes first. A newborn can cry loudly without producing the kind of visible emotional tears that later become familiar on the human face. The early signal is primarily vocal. Air moves through the respiratory system, the vocal folds vibrate, facial muscles contract, and a powerful sound reaches anyone within hearing distance. For a highly dependent infant, such a signal has obvious practical value. Human babies cannot walk toward food, move themselves to safety, or regulate every physical need alone. Their survival depends heavily on caregivers noticing changes in their condition and responding. Crying is one way the infant body recruits that attention. Similar principles are found far beyond our species. The young of many mammals produce separation or distress calls, and caregivers can respond to those sounds. The basic relationship between a dependent young animal, a vocal signal, and an attending adult is therefore older than humanity. We should not imagine an exact prehistoric scene or claim to know how a particular ancestor interpreted an infant's cry. Fossils cannot preserve a sound, and archaeology cannot recover the private feelings of a parent holding a crying child. But comparative biology makes one point clear. Vocal distress did not have to wait for human speech, human culture, or emotional tears. It belonged to an older biological world in which sound could alter the behavior of another individual. That older system makes the human tear more puzzling rather than less. If an infant can summon attention with a voice, Why would visible moisture on the face later become connected to emotion at all? One possibility is that vocal crying and emotional tears do not perform exactly the same social work. Sound can travel across a room or through darkness. Tears require vision and usually proximity. A loud cry can announce urgent distress. A tearful face may provide quieter information once another person is already close. Modern human development gives us a useful clue without providing an evolutionary answer. As children grow, crying changes. Language becomes available, voluntary control increases, social expectations are learned, and tears can appear in emotional situations far more complex than the immediate physical needs of a newborn. People eventually cry over memories, relationships, disappointment, relief, empathy, music, or events that exist partly in thought. The behavior has moved into a world of meanings that an infant cannot yet express. Still, the ancient foundation remains visible beneath it. Before humans can explain distress, the body can signal it. Before a child can say that something is wrong, a sound can bring another person near. Emotional tears may later join that exchange, but they enter a communication system that was already functioning from the beginning of life and has deep roots in mammalian history. The newborn, therefore, offers an important clue to the larger mystery without solving it. Human crying did not begin as a silent drop running down an adult face. It begins, in every new life, with a voice capable of reaching another human being before language can carry the message. That sequence reminds us that the mystery of tears begins inside a much older relationship between dependence, distress, attention, and care. A human infant begins life with a voice that can demand attention long before the face can communicate in the subtle ways seen later in childhood and adulthood. The earliest cries are loud, rhythmic, and difficult for caregivers to ignore. They can accompany hunger, discomfort, pain, fatigue, or separation, but they are not precise sentences. A caregiver must interpret the sound together with context, movement, facial tension, and the infant's condition. As development continues, this communication system becomes more complex. The child gains better control over the face, begins to understand other people, learns language, and gradually enters a social world in which expressions can be noticed, interpreted, hidden, or deliberately shown. Visible emotional tears become part of that world. This developmental sequence is important, but it must be handled carefully. It is tempting to imagine that because vocal crying appears early in an individual life and emotional tears become more obvious later, human evolution must have followed the same path. Biology does not allow such a simple conclusion. The development of one child does not replay the evolutionary history of our species. What it can show us is that vocal distress and visible tears are not identical behaviors, and that they can occupy different places within human communication. Sound has an advantage. It can travel beyond the face. A caregiver can hear a child who is not looking directly at them, and a cry can reach through darkness or around an obstacle. Tears are different. They depend heavily on sight. Another person must be close enough and attentive enough to notice moisture in the eyes or tracks on the cheeks. That makes tears less effective as a distant alarm, but potentially more suited to close social interaction. As humans grow, crying also becomes less tightly connected to immediate physical need. A child can cry because a caregiver leaves, because of frustration, because another person is hurt, or because an anticipated event does not happen. Later, adults may cry in response to bereavement, reconciliation, relief, music, memory, shame, gratitude, or experiences that combine several emotions at once. The visible response remains bodily, but the causes can become dependent on memory, expectation, relationships, and meaning. This widening range suggests that emotional tears are embedded in the human capacity to represent events that are not physically present in front of the eyes. Yet even here, caution is necessary. We cannot say that tears evolved because humans developed complex thought, nor can we identify a single stage of prehistory when the shift occurred. No preserved skull can tell us whether its owner once cried during reunion, and no stone tool records the emotional state of the hands that made it. The origin of human emotional tearing therefore remains hidden from direct archaeological observation. What development offers instead is a living example of how several systems can become coordinated. Vocalization, facial movement, autonomic activity, attention to caregivers, social learning, and language. Tears do not replace the voice. Adults still sob, call out, become silent, speak through tears, or cry without making a sound. The channels remain available together, each carrying somewhat different information. A voice can announce distress across distance, while a tearful face may change the meaning of an encounter already happening at close range. The transition from sound to face is therefore not a clean replacement, but an expansion of the ways human emotion can become observable. From the beginning of life, distress can reach another person before words exist. Later, the face can add a quieter signal that may remain visible even when the voice has stopped. Somewhere in the deeper history of our lineage, an existing tier system became connected to this social landscape, but development cannot tell us exactly when or why. It can only reveal the unusual result. Human emotion can move through sound, posture, expression, and finally through water gathering at the edge of the eye. Helplessness is one of the oldest conditions a social animal can experience, and for human beings it begins almost immediately after birth. A newborn cannot obtain food alone, escape danger alone, or regulate every discomfort without assistance. Survival depends on other people noticing changes in the infant's condition and responding. Vocal crying is one of the earliest ways that dependence becomes visible to caregivers, but the deeper pattern is broader than sound. Human life begins inside a relationship in which one body must sometimes communicate need to another before language exists. This makes helplessness an important clue when we think about emotional tears, although it is not a complete explanation. Many animals also depend heavily on parental care, and many young mammals produce distress calls when separated, cold, frightened, or uncomfortable. Human ancestors, therefore, inherited a biological world in which vulnerability and social response were already connected. What may have changed over the course of the human lineage was not the existence of helplessness itself, but the complexity and duration of the social relationships surrounding it. Human children require prolonged care, and adults also depend on cooperation, shared knowledge, protection, and social bonds throughout life. This does not mean that we can reconstruct exactly how prehistoric people felt or how they responded to someone in distress. Archaeological evidence can sometimes suggest care for injured or impaired individuals, but it cannot reveal the private emotional experience of the people involved. A healed injury may tell us that someone survived for a considerable period, perhaps with assistance, but it cannot tell us whether another person cried beside them. Tears vanish too quickly to enter the archaeological record. Even so, the broader importance of social dependence gives researchers a reasonable context for asking what visible emotional tears might do. A person who is crying may appear less threatening, more vulnerable, or more in need of support. Experiments with modern observers suggest that visible tears can change how a face is interpreted, and can increase perceptions of sadness or helplessness in many situations. That does not prove that tears evolve specifically to request care. A present-day effect cannot automatically be turned into an evolutionary origin story. It does, however, show that tears can alter social perception, which makes helplessness relevant to the puzzle. The connection becomes more complicated when we notice that adults cry, even when no practical help can solve the problem. Someone may cry after the death of a loved one, when the event cannot be reversed. Another person may cry after years of separation finally end, when danger has already passed. Tears can appear after humiliation, exhaustion, relief, gratitude, or overwhelming joy. Helplessness, therefore, cannot simply mean physical weakness. It may include situations in which a person cannot change what has happened, cannot immediately control an emotional state, or cannot fully express an experience through words. This possibility brings us closer to human origins without pretending to know more than the evidence allows. Our species developed within social environments where attention to the condition of others mattered, but emotional tears may have become useful only as one element within a larger system of voice, face, touch, posture, and relationship. A tearful face does not command a single response. One observer may approach, another may remain distant, and culture can influence whether crying is accepted, concealed, or judged. The signal is therefore flexible rather than automatic. What remains striking is that a bodily system designed to keep the eye functioning can participate in moments when a human being reaches the limit of what can be controlled, changed, or communicated. The newborn begins with dependence and a voice. The adult may possess language, memory, social knowledge, and considerable physical independence, yet tears can still appear when those capacities are not enough to resolve an experience. Somewhere between our ancient inheritance of distress signaling and the complex emotional life of modern humans, visible tears became connected to vulnerability in a way that other known animals do not regularly display. Whether that connection first favored caregiving, reduced conflict, strengthened close relationships, or emerged through several pressures together remains uncertain. Helplessness gives us a plausible doorway into the mystery, but it does not yet tell us why evolution opened that doorway through the eyes. Behind every visible tear is a small biological system that works almost continuously, usually without attracting attention. Near the upper outer area of each eye sits the main lacrimal gland, one of the structures that contributes much of the watery fluid associated with tears. It does not work alone. The surface of the eye is supported by secretions from several tissues, including glands along the eyelids and cells in the conjunctiva, creating a thin tear film that contains water, salts, lipids, proteins, mucus-related molecules, and defensive substances. These components help the tear film spread across the eye, reduce evaporation, maintain a smooth optical surface, and protect exposed tissue. Every blink redistributes that film. Most of the time, the process is quiet enough that we never notice it. The fluid eventually drains through tiny openings near the inner corners of the eyelids and passes into channels connected with the nasal cavity, which is one reason the nose can begin to run during heavy crying. Nothing about this basic arrangement requires sadness, memory, or grief. It is an eye maintenance system before it is anything else. Yet the same anatomy can suddenly become involved when a person hears devastating news, feels overwhelming relief, remembers someone who is gone, or experiences an emotion strong enough to produce tears. The lacrimal gland has not somehow understood the meaning of the event. Instead, signals from the nervous system alter its activity. Tear production is influenced by autonomic pathways, the networks that regulate many bodily processes outside ordinary conscious control. Emotional states can affect these networks just as they can change heart rate, breathing, sweating, the voice, facial muscles, and blood flow. This gives us an important distinction between mechanism and explanation. We can describe how nerve signals can reach the lacrimal system and increase secretion, but that does not tell us why human evolution linked emotional states to visible tearing in the first place. The machinery can be mapped far more easily than its evolutionary history. Even the word gland can make the process sound simpler than it is. Crying is not produced by a single switch hidden behind the eye. Brain regions involved in emotion, attention, autonomic control, memory, and social processing interact through complex networks, and the exact pattern can vary with the situation. A person crying from physical pain is not necessarily undergoing the same internal sequence as someone crying from reunion or grief, even though both may end with tears on the cheeks. The final visible act is therefore the meeting point of many processes rather than evidence of one simple emotional circuit. This also helps explain why the origin of emotional crying cannot be read directly from anatomy. Our ancestors already possessed eyes that needed lubrication and protection. They already possessed autonomic systems that changed the body during fear, pain, arousal, and social interaction. The evolutionary novelty, if we can call it that, did not require the creation of a new organ dedicated only to sadness. It could have emerged through changes in how older systems were connected and regulated, but the details of those changes are not preserved. Soft tissue and nerve pathways do not leave the kind of fossil record that bones and teeth do. We cannot inspect an ancient skull and identify the moment when grief first gained reliable access to tear production. The most we can do is compare living humans with other animals, study development, examine the nervous system, and observe what happens when people cry. That evidence gives us a biological map of the present, not a photograph of the evolutionary past. Still, the map is revealing. A tear begins as part of a system built to maintain the eye, but emotional crying recruits that system for an event that may be entirely internal or social. A memory can activate the body strongly enough to change the surface of the eye. A loss that happened years earlier can produce fluid in the present. A reunion can do the same. The gland itself is small, but the experiences capable of reaching it can involve memory, attachment, expectation, pain, and meaning. That contrast is what makes human crying so unusual. The biology of tears is concrete and measurable. The reason emotion became connected to that biology remains far less certain. Emotion does not remain confined to the brain. A frightening thought can accelerate the heart. Embarrassment can warm the face. Anxiety can tighten the stomach. Relief can soften the muscles and change breathing. Crying belongs to this same broad relationship between emotional processing and the body, but the pathways that produce it are more complicated than a single command traveling from one place in the brain directly to the eyes. Emotional experiences involve networks that help evaluate events, memories, threats, rewards, relationships, and internal bodily states. These networks communicate with systems that regulate breathing, heart rate, facial expression, vocalization, and glandular activity. Among them is the autonomic nervous system, which helps control many processes that occur without deliberate instruction. A person usually does not decide to increase tear secretion in the same way they decide to raise a hand. During emotional crying, changes in neural activity can influence pathways that reach the lacrimal glands, allowing an experience that may exist only as memory or meaning to produce a physical change at the surface of the eye. Scientists have identified several brain regions associated with emotion and autonomic regulation that may participate in crying, including structures within the limbic system, hypothalamus, brainstem, and areas of the cerebral cortex. But it would be misleading to imagine a small location whose only job is to make humans cry. Emotional crying emerges from interactions among systems, rather than from one isolated center. The same person may cry after pain, bereavement, frustration, reunion, relief, or an unexpectedly moving experience, and those situations do not begin with identical patterns of thought or sensation. What they share is that emotional processing can eventually reach bodily systems that influence tears. This connection also helps explain why crying often involves more than wet eyes. Breathing may become irregular. Muscles around the face contract. The throat can feel tight. Speech may become difficult. The nose may run as increased tear fluid drains toward the nasal cavity. Heart rate and other autonomic responses may change as well. Crying is therefore better understood as a coordinated bodily state than as simple leakage from the eyes. Even so, understanding these physical events does not reveal what emotional tears originally contributed to human survival or social life. A neural pathway can explain how the response happens today, without telling us why that pathway became reliably connected to intense emotion during human evolution. The distinction becomes especially important when we look toward our origins. Earlier members of the human lineage inherited brains already capable of coordinating fear, pain, attachment, arousal, vocal distress, and bodily regulation. They also inherited eyes that required constant lubrication. Emotional crying did not necessarily require an entirely new biological system. Evolution could have altered the strength, timing, or coordination of connections among systems that were already present. Such changes are plausible in principle, but the exact sequence cannot be reconstructed from fossils. Neural connections do not fossilize, and emotional reactions leave no durable mark that archaeologists can recover thousands of generations later. We cannot determine from an ancient skull whether its owner produced tears during grief or whether another member of the group responded to that face. Modern neuroscience, therefore, tells us about the machinery that exists now, while comparative biology and behavioral research help us consider how unusual that machinery may be. This difference between present mechanism and historical origin protects us from a common mistake. If researchers discover that a certain neural pathway participates in crying, that discovery does not prove that the pathway evolved for crying. Biological systems are frequently reused. A circuit involved in one function can become connected to another. An old physiological response can acquire a new social consequence. Emotional tears may represent exactly this kind of evolutionary layering, with ancient systems for eye protection and autonomic regulation becoming incorporated into a distinctly human pattern of emotional expression. The body then becomes a surface on which internal states can appear. A memory cannot be seen directly, but the trembling voice that follows it can be heard. Grief cannot be touched, but changes in posture can be observed. An overwhelming feeling has no visible shape of its own, yet tears can make its presence apparent on the face. That transformation from private state to observable body is central to the mystery. We understand many of the routes through which the brain can influence glands, muscles, breathing, and circulation, but those routes still do not explain why emotional arousal in humans gains such consistent access to the tear system. The nervous system shows us how an invisible experience can reach the eye. It does not yet tell us why evolution made that particular connection worth keeping. Knowing how tears are produced brings us close to the machinery of crying, but it does not carry us across the most difficult gap. We can follow signals from emotional processing in the brain toward autonomic pathways, and from those pathways toward the glands that release tears. We can observe changes in breathing, facial muscles, voice, and heart activity while a person cries. Yet none of these observations answers the deeper question of why emotional experience became connected to tear production in humans at all. This is the missing bridge between physiology and evolutionary explanation. A mechanism tells us what happens inside a living body. An evolutionary explanation must account for how that response could arise, persist, and become integrated into human behavior across generations. These are different questions, and confusing them can create conclusions that sound stronger than the evidence allows. The difficulty begins with the age of the systems involved. Tears used for maintaining the eye are evolutionarily older than humans. Autonomic regulation is also ancient, as are many emotional and defensive responses shared across mammals. Facial expressions, vocal distress, attachment between young and caregivers, and sensitivity to social signals all existed in some form before modern humans appeared. Emotional tearing therefore seems to involve a new relationship among old biological components, rather than the sudden appearance of a completely new structure. Evolution often works this way. Existing features can become connected differently, used in new contexts, or acquire consequences that were not part of their earlier role. But knowing that such a pathway is possible does not reveal the path that human ancestors actually followed. The fossil record cannot preserve tears. It cannot preserve the temporary pattern of nerve activity that accompanied a moment of grief. Even unusually complete human remains tell us about bones, teeth, injury, growth, and aspects of anatomy, not whether a person's eyes filled with tears during reunion or loss. Archaeological evidence can sometimes show that individuals lived with serious injuries or impairments for long periods, which may indicate forms of social support, but it cannot reveal the emotional expressions exchanged between those people. This places emotional crying in a category of human behavior whose origins must be inferred indirectly. Researchers can compare humans with other animals, examine how crying develops during childhood, measure how observers respond to tearful faces, and study the neural and physiological systems active during crying. Together, these approaches can narrow the possibilities. They cannot return us to the first generation in which emotional tears became common enough to matter. Several explanations, therefore, remain plausible. Tears may make vulnerability easier to detect. They may encourage approach and caregiving in some circumstances. They may reduce the appearance of threat or signal that a person is unable or unwilling to continue conflict. They may contribute to close social communication because they are most easily seen at short distance. Crying may also interact with internal regulation, although claims that tears simply remove emotional stress from the body are too simple for the available evidence. These possibilities are not mutually exclusive. A behavior can affect both the person producing it and the people observing it. Its function can also change over evolutionary time. What began as one consequence of an existing physiological connection could later become embedded in social expectations, attachment, ritual, mourning, and interpersonal communication. This complexity is especially relevant to human origins because our lineage increasingly depended on prolonged relationships, learning from others, cooperation, and sensitivity to social information. We cannot say that these conditions caused emotional tears to evolve, but they provide a biological and social environment in which visible emotional signals could have consequences. The bridge we are missing is therefore historical. We can see one side clearly, eyes that require tears and nervous systems, capable of controlling them. We can also see the other side, modern humans whose tears influence how other people perceive their emotional state. Between those 2 points lies a sequence of evolutionary changes that left almost no direct physical trace. The absence of that record does not make the question meaningless. It simply changes the kind of answer science can responsibly offer. Instead of one certain origin story, we have converging clues from anatomy, behavior, development, psychology, and comparative biology. Each clue limits the possibilities without closing the mystery. Human emotional tears are real, measurable, and biologically connected to systems we understand increasingly well. What remains uncertain is why this particular connection became so deeply woven into the emotional life of our species. Crying seems, at first glance, poorly suited to a dangerous world. When a person begins to cry intensely, vision can become blurred, breathing may become irregular, the face changes, the voice can break, and attention may turn inward toward pain, fear, grief, or helplessness. None of these effects appears especially useful if the immediate task is to run, fight, hide, or watch carefully for danger. A wet eye is not a stronger eye. Tears do not sharpen vision. They do not increase speed or strength. In some situations, they can make it harder to see clearly for a short time, while the swollen face and altered voice may reveal that a person is distressed. If emotional crying had evolved only as a response to immediate physical threat, this would be difficult to understand. Yet humans do not cry only when danger is present. People may cry after the danger has ended, when a loved one is lost, when someone returns after a long absence, when humiliation cannot be undone, or when relief finally arrives after prolonged tension. The response often appears when action is no longer enough to solve the problem. This does not prove that crying evolved for moments of helplessness, but it changes the question. Perhaps emotional tears are not primarily designed to improve the performance of the individual who produces them. Their importance may lie partly in what they do to other people who see them. That possibility becomes more plausible when we remember the social history of our species. Human beings depend on close relationships for an unusually large portion of life. Children require long care, adults cooperate, knowledge is shared, injuries may be survived with assistance, and social bonds can influence access to protection, food, information, and companionship. We should not imagine exact prehistoric scenes that cannot be verified, but the broader importance of cooperation in human evolution is well established. In such a setting, a signal that reveals vulnerability could have consequences, even if it temporarily offers no physical advantage to the person producing it. A tearful face may make distress harder to hide. It may alter how another person judges threat, need, sincerity, or emotional intensity. Modern experiments suggest that visible tears can change how observers interpret a face, and can increase perceptions of sadness or need for support in many contexts. That does not tell us what happened thousands of generations ago, but it shows that tears are not socially neutral. Their presence can modify an interaction. This creates a different kind of evolutionary logic. A trait does not have to make an individual stronger in every moment to persist. In a social species, a behavior can matter because it changes the actions of others. A cry can summon attention, a posture can signal submission, a facial expression can warn, reassure, or invite approach. Emotional tears may belong to this broader family of social signals, although the exact function remains uncertain. The fact that tears can interfere slightly with vision may even remind us that they are not best understood as tools for escaping immediate danger. Their value, if they carried one during evolution, may have been tied to what happens after another human notices them. Still, caution is essential. Not every person who sees tears responds with care. Tears can be ignored, misunderstood, or judged differently across relationships and cultures. A response that often influences social perception is not the same as a universal signal with one fixed meaning. The deeper point is more modest. Emotional crying makes little sense if we search only for a direct physical benefit to the eye or body during danger. It begins to make more sense when we place the crying individual inside a social world, where being seen can sometimes matter as much as seeing clearly. The apparent weakness of tears may therefore be the clue that pushes us away from survival as a solitary problem and towards survival as something humans often accomplish through one another. A tear changes a human face in a way that is small in physical size but surprisingly powerful in social perception. The eyes become brighter, moisture gathers along the lower eyelid, and thin tracks may appear on the cheeks. Nothing about this signal is loud. It does not travel across a landscape like a scream, and it cannot be detected from very far away. Yet when another person is close enough to see it, the presence of tears can change how the entire face is understood. Researchers who compare images of the same face with and without visible tears have found that tears can increase the impression that the person is sad, vulnerable, or in need of support. This does not mean that every observer reacts in the same way, or that tears always produce compassion. Human responses depend on context, relationship, culture, and expectations. Still, the effect is important because it suggests that tears are not merely excess fluid escaping from an emotional body. They can alter the information another person receives. Consider how little the tear itself actually tells us. It does not identify what happened. A tear cannot tell an observer whether someone has lost a parent, survived a frightening experience, heard unexpected good news, or simply reached the end of a long period of tension. The surrounding face and situation provide that meaning. What the tear may contribute is intensity. It can make an emotional state more difficult to overlook. A person may say that everything is fine, but visible tears create additional information that words alone cannot erase. In this sense, emotional crying may function less like a sentence and more like an amplifier attached to the face. This possibility is relevant to human origins because our ancestors already depended on facial information long before written language existed, and probably long before spoken language reached its modern complexity. Although the details of prehistoric communication cannot be reconstructed with certainty, faces reveal attention, threat, fear, pain, interest, and many other states through combinations of gaze and muscular movement. Emotional tears could have entered this older system by changing how those expressions were perceived. The eye already occupied a central place in face-to-face interaction. Adding visible moisture may have made certain states more noticeable without requiring a completely new gesture. Some researchers have proposed an even more specific idea. Tears may reduce the appearance of aggression or signal vulnerability. A person whose vision is blurred and whose face is visibly distressed may appear less prepared for confrontation. This could, in principle, influence the behavior of someone nearby. But such explanations remain hypotheses about evolutionary function rather than established accounts of how crying originated. We cannot observe ancient interactions directly, and no archaeological object records whether tears once prevented conflict between two early humans. Modern experiments can show effects in present-day observers, not the exact selection pressures of the distant past. Another clue lies in the unusual closeness required to see tears clearly. Loud distress calls can reach many individuals at once. Emotional tears work best at conversational distance, where another person can see the eyes and interpret the face. That makes them potentially suited to interactions involving caregivers, partners, relatives, companions, or other nearby individuals. Again, we cannot claim that this is why tears evolved, but it fits the broader pattern of a signal embedded in close social relationships. Human survival did not depend only on avoiding predators or finding food. It also depended on maintaining relationships, recognizing need, sharing attention, and responding to the condition of others. Emotional tears may have become meaningful within that social environment because they transformed an internal state into something visible without requiring deliberate explanation. The person crying does not have to compose a message. The body produces one automatically. This does not make tears perfectly honest, nor does it mean they cannot occur in complicated or strategic social situations. Human behavior is far too flexible for such a simple rule. It does mean that tears can create information before language finishes explaining what is happening. The evolutionary question therefore becomes narrower and more interesting. Perhaps the value of emotional tears was never that they protected the person who produced them from the physical world. Perhaps their significance emerged because another human could see them and respond differently. That possibility does not solve the mystery, but it reveals why something as quiet as water on a face may have mattered in a species increasingly dependent on understanding the minds and needs of others. A tearful face can make vulnerability visible before a person explains anything. The eyes become wet, the muscles around the face may tighten or soften, the voice may weaken. and the whole expression can suggest that the person is struggling to maintain control. For another human standing nearby, this combination may matter because social life depends not only on recognizing danger, but also on recognizing when someone is no longer a threat, when assistance may be needed, or when an emotional state has become difficult to manage. This has led researchers to consider the possibility that tears function partly as signals of vulnerability. The idea is plausible, but it must remain a hypothesis rather than a final answer. Modern experiments show that people often judge tearful faces as sadder, more helpless, or more deserving of support than the same faces without visible tears. Those findings tell us something about how tears are perceived today. They do not allow us to reconstruct the exact pressures that shaped crying in the distant past. Still, the pattern is useful. A signal does not need to contain detailed information to influence behavior. A tear does not explain what happened, but it can change the emotional meaning of a face. In some contexts, it may suggest that the person is overwhelmed, unable to continue a confrontation, or in need of care. That possibility becomes especially interesting when we consider the long human dependence on social relationships. Our ancestors survived not only through individual strength but through cooperation, food sharing, protection, teaching, and prolonged care of young. We cannot know how any specific prehistoric group interpreted tears, and we should not imagine emotional scenes that archaeology cannot verify. But we can say that sensitivity to the condition of other people would have mattered in a species whose survival was deeply social. A visible sign of vulnerability could therefore have influenced whether another person approached, withdrew, protected, comforted, or reduced aggression. Yet tears are not a simple command. They do not force compassion. A tearful person may be ignored, misunderstood, distrusted, or treated differently depending on the relationship and the surrounding situation. Culture also shapes when crying is accepted or suppressed. This variability tells us that emotional tears are not a universal switch that automatically produces one response. Their meaning is interpreted through context. That makes them more like one layer in a larger social display involving gaze, posture, voice, and facial expression. The human face was already a rich source of information before tears became part of emotional life. If tears added anything, it may have been emphasis rather than a completely new message. They may have made weakness harder to hide, softened the appearance of hostility, or signaled that ordinary self-control had been exceeded. These effects could matter in close relationships, where another person is near enough to see the eyes clearly. A distant alarm is useful when danger must be announced. A quiet signal may be more useful when the problem exists between two people already sharing the same space. This distinction does not prove why emotional crying evolved, but it helps explain why such a subtle signal might have persisted despite offering little direct physical advantage. The body may have turned vulnerability into something observable at exactly the distance where social response becomes possible. Somewhere in the human lineage, older systems for emotion, facial communication, and tear production became linked closely enough for this to occur. We cannot recover the first time it happened, and we cannot know whether care, conflict reduction, attachment, or some combination mattered most. What we can see is the result in modern humans. When words become uncertain or unnecessary, tears can reveal that something inside the person has crossed a threshold that another person may notice. Vulnerability may therefore be part of what tears communicate, but the larger mystery remains open because showing what tears do now is not the same as proving why evolution connected emotion to the eyes in the first place. Imagine looking at two photographs of the same person. The face is identical in both images, the same eyes, the same mouth, the same angle of the head, the same lighting. In one image, however, visible tears remain beneath the eyes. In the other, those tears have been removed. Nothing else has changed, yet people often interpret the two faces differently. Experimental studies using this kind of comparison have found that visible tears can increase judgments of sadness, helplessness, emotional intensity, and the need for support. This is one of the clearest clues we have that emotional tears are not simply private bodily events. Once they appear on the face, they can change the social information another person receives. The tear itself contains almost no explanation. It does not tell an observer what caused the emotion, how long it has lasted, or what should happen next. The surrounding face and situation must supply those details. Still, the presence of tears can make an emotional state seem more obvious. A face that appears merely tense or uncertain without tears may look deeply distressed when tears are present. This effect is sometimes described as the tears adding meaning to the expression, but it may be more accurate to say that they alter the weight given to information already visible in the face. That distinction matters when thinking about human origins. Our ancestors did not need emotional tears in order to possess expressive faces. Facial movement, gaze, posture, and vocalization were already part of social communication in primates and other mammals. The unusual human feature may therefore have been the addition of a small visual cue that could intensify how a nearby observer interpreted an existing expression. We cannot know when this connection first appeared. Tears leave no durable trace, and the emotional reactions of ancient people cannot be recovered from bones or stone tools. What experiments on living humans can show is that the visual presence of tears has measurable consequences today. This evidence does not prove that social signaling was the original evolutionary function of crying, but it makes that possibility difficult to ignore. The effect also helps explain why emotional tears are so dependent on proximity. A scream can be heard from far away, but a thin line of moisture on the cheek requires another person to be near enough to see the face. That makes tears poorly suited to broadcasting danger across distance, yet potentially useful during close interaction. A caregiver holding a child, a partner sitting beside someone in grief, or two people facing one another after conflict can all see details that would disappear from farther away. We should not project these modern scenes directly into prehistory, but they demonstrate the kind of social distance at which tears can operate. Another important point is that tears do not work alone. Observers interpret them together with facial muscles, gaze, voice, posture, and context. The same tears on a smiling face may be understood as joy or relief, while tears on a tense face may suggest pain, fear, or frustration. This flexibility prevents us from treating tears as a fixed code for sadness. Their apparent function may be to make emotional significance more visible, while leaving the situation to define what that significance means. In this way, a very small physical change can reorganize the meaning of an entire face. That is remarkable, because it suggests that the evolutionary importance of tears, if they carried one, may not have depended on what they did for the eye at all. Their effect may have emerged in the mind of the observer. The person crying produces fluid, but the social consequence occurs in another nervous system, where the face is interpreted and a response is prepared. Somewhere in the history of our lineage, this silent visual cue became part of the exchange between human bodies. We can measure the effect now, but the reason evolution preserved it still remains uncertain. Seeing tears on another person's face does not simply tell us that their eyes are wet. It can change the way we judge the person standing in front of us. In controlled experiments, researchers have shown participants' faces with visible tears and compared their reactions with responses to similar images in which the tears were absent. Across many situations, the presence of tears tends to make sadness appear stronger and can increase impressions of helplessness, vulnerability, or a need for support. This does not mean that every tear produces sympathy, or that all people interpret crying in exactly the same way. Context matters greatly. The identity of the person, the relationship between observer and crier, the reason for the emotion, cultural expectations, and the rest of the facial expression can all alter the response. Still, the repeated finding that visible tears influence judgment gives us something important to work with. Emotional tears do not remain only inside the biology of the person producing them. Once they become visible, they enter the social world. The observer's brain must decide what the wet face means, and that interpretation may affect whether the observer approaches, offers help, becomes cautious, or simply pays more attention. This is especially interesting because the physical signal is so small. A few drops of fluid do not change the person's age, strength, identity, or words, yet they can reshape the emotional meaning of the entire face. The effect reminds us that human communication often depends on subtle combinations of signals rather than on one dramatic gesture. Eyes, eyebrows, mouth, voice, posture, and movement all contribute information, and tears can alter how these pieces are read together. A neutral or tense expression may seem more sorrowful when tears are visible. A face showing relief may appear more emotionally overwhelmed. Tears can therefore act less like a dictionary, with one fixed definition, and more like a marker that tells the observer that the emotional significance of the moment is unusually high. This may help explain why crying is so closely tied to face-to-face interaction. During the long history of the human lineage, survival increasingly depended on the ability to interpret other individuals, maintain relationships, care for dependent young, cooperate, and respond to changes in the condition of group members. We cannot know how prehistoric people interpreted tears, and no archaeological evidence can preserve their immediate judgments. It would be unjustified to claim that a particular ancestor saw another person crying and responded in a particular way. What modern research can demonstrate is that human observers today are sensitive to tears, and that removing the tears while keeping much of the face unchanged can alter perception. That makes a social role for crying plausible without proving its original evolutionary function. The distinction is essential. A trait can have effects today that differ from the pressures that shaped it in the past. Culture can also modify how a biological response is expressed and understood. Some people learn to conceal tears, others are permitted to show them more openly, and the same crying behavior may be interpreted differently depending on circumstances. Yet beneath that variation lies a consistent biological fact. Emotional tears provide visible information that another person can potentially use. This creates an unusual form of communication because the signal often appears without deliberate planning. A person may try not to cry and fail. The tears themselves can therefore reveal something that speech is attempting to hide. That does not make them perfectly honest, because humans can deliberately produce or exaggerate many expressions, and observers can misinterpret genuine emotion. But involuntary crying can make emotional arousal harder to conceal. For a social species, that difficulty in hiding internal state could have consequences. It might encourage care in some relationships, reduce perceived threat in others, or simply make another person stop and examine what is happening more carefully. Each possibility has some support as a modern social effect, but none alone can yet explain the evolutionary origin of emotional tears. What the evidence allows us to say is narrower and more useful. Tears change social judgment. The signal produced by one nervous system can alter perception inside another nervous system, creating a biological event that stretches across two people. Human emotional crying, therefore, cannot be understood only by studying the person whose eyes are wet. The person watching is also part of the phenomenon, because whatever value tears acquired during human history may have depended partly on what happened after another human saw them. Crying begins inside one body, but it rarely ends there. A person feels grief, fear, relief, frustration, or another powerful state. The nervous system changes, the lacrimal glands increase tear production, and moisture becomes visible on the face. At that moment, something private enters a shared space. Another person can see the tears, interpret the expression, and change their own behavior in response. This is what makes emotional crying more than a physiological event. The tears are produced by one nervous system, yet their consequences can unfold inside another. An observer may become more attentive, approach more gently, offer comfort, reduce confrontation, or simply recognize that the person is experiencing something intense. None of these responses is guaranteed. Human beings can ignore tears, distrust them, misunderstand them, or react differently depending on culture and relationship. Even so, the possibility that tears influence another person changes the way we should think about their biology. If emotional crying mattered during human evolution, its effects may have depended less on what the liquid did for the eye and more on what the wet face did to social interaction. This idea fits a broader pattern found throughout animal communication. Signals matter because receivers respond to them. A call has no social effect if no one hears it. A gesture has no effect if no one sees it. The same principle applies to tears. Their significance emerges only when someone nearby notices them and connects them with the rest of the face, the voice, the posture, and the situation. Human beings are especially sensitive to faces, and our social lives require constant judgments about attention, intention, fear, trust, pain, and need. Emotional tears enter this already complex system as one additional visual cue. They do not provide a complete explanation of what someone feels, but they can make the emotional condition harder to overlook. This may be important when considering human origins. Our lineage depended increasingly on prolonged care, cooperation, shared knowledge, and repeated interaction with familiar individuals. We cannot know whether a particular prehistoric person responded to tears with comfort, and the archaeological record cannot preserve such an exchange. Yet we can reasonably study the kinds of social environments in which visible emotional signals might have consequences. A person who could recognize another individual's distress might alter behavior in ways that affected both of them. A vulnerable individual might receive support. A conflict might change direction. A caregiver might remain close. These are possibilities, not recovered scenes. What makes them scientifically interesting is that modern experiments show that tears can influence social perception, giving us evidence that the signal has real effects now. The next question is whether those effects were important enough, consistently enough, over evolutionary time to help maintain the behavior. We do not yet have a definitive answer. Emotional crying may have served several functions at once, or its role may have shifted as human social life became more complex. It may have begun from one physiological connection and later acquired meanings through culture, attachment, language, mourning, and ritual. The same tear can now appear during loss, reunion, gratitude, defeat, or joy, which warns us against searching for one simple message. What remains consistent is the transformation itself. An internal state becomes visible, another human detects it, and a new social situation begins. The person who cries may not intend to communicate anything, but the face has changed in a way that others can read. This is why emotional tears cannot be understood by studying the eye alone. Their biology extends outward into relationships. A gland releases fluid, but the meaning of that fluid is completed only when another mind sees it. That social completion may be one of the distinctive features of human crying. The tear itself is ordinary fluid, but once another person sees it, the event becomes relational, linking one emotional state with another person's attention and response. Human beings survive through relationships to an unusual degree, and that dependence begins long before a child can understand what dependence means. A human infant needs warmth, protection, food, physical contact, and repeated attention from other people, and this reliance continues far longer than it does in many other animals. Not because humans are simply weak, but because human development involves a long period in which the brain, body, language, practical skills, and social understanding are still being formed. Throughout this time, survival depends on the ability of caregivers and other group members to notice signals of need and respond to them. This creates an important background for thinking about emotional tears, because a species that depends heavily on cooperation also depends heavily on information about the condition of other individuals. Hunger, fear, injury, exhaustion, conflict, and separation can all influence behavior, and recognizing those changes can affect whether another person approaches, protects, shares, waits, or withdraws, long before modern society existed. Members of the human lineage were already social primates, but we must be cautious about describing exactly how particular prehistoric communities behaved. Archaeology can reveal repeated occupation of places, food processing, movement of materials, injuries that healed, and many other traces of social life. Yet it cannot preserve a conversation, a comforting gesture, or a tear moving down a face. What the broader evidence supports is that cooperation, learning from others, and prolonged care became deeply important within human evolution, and this social dependence creates a setting in which visible emotional information could matter. Emotional tears are especially interesting because they work at close range. A distant individual may hear a shout, but cannot easily see moisture gathering around the eyes. Tears, therefore, belong to the intimate scale of social perception, the scale at which people can study another face, hear changes in the voice, notice breathing, and respond to subtle movements. This does not prove that tears evolved specifically for close relationships, but it gives us a useful contrast with older distress signals. A loud vocalization can recruit attention from a distance, while a tearful face may modify an encounter that is already taking place between nearby individuals. For humans, such encounters are central to everyday survival and social organization. Children depend on adults. Injured people may depend on companions. Knowledge passes between generations. Tasks can be divided. food can be shared, and threats can be faced collectively. None of these facts requires us to imagine that prehistoric people thought or felt exactly as modern people do, but they show why sensitivity to another person's condition could carry consequences. A signal that makes vulnerability more visible may therefore have value, even if it provides no direct physical advantage to the individual producing it. This is one reason emotional crying cannot be understood only by asking what tears do inside the body. We also have to ask what another person does after seeing them. Modern studies suggest that tears can influence judgments of sadness, helplessness, warmth, and need for support, although responses vary and no reaction is universal. These findings do not allow us to move backward through time and declare that caregiving caused emotional tears to evolve. They simply show that tears can affect social perception today. The deeper evolutionary question remains open because several processes may have interacted. The human tear system already protected the eye. Emotional arousal already altered the body. Faces already communicated social information. And increasing dependence on relationships may have created situations in which making an internal state more visible had consequences. Evolution could have strengthened connections among these older systems without inventing a completely new organ. But the precise sequence is lost. There is no preserved record showing when emotional tearing became common, or whether its earliest effects involved caregiving, conflict, attachment, reconciliation, or something else entirely. What we can see is the outcome in living humans. A person may possess language, strength, experience, and independence. Yet in moments of loss or overwhelming emotion, the body can still reveal need without asking permission. Another person may notice, and an interaction may change. This makes human dependence more than a background feature of crying. It may be one of the environments in which crying became meaningful. Because for a creature whose survival has long depended on other creatures of the same kind, being understood by another person can sometimes matter almost as much as acting alone. A scream and a tear can both reveal distress, but they operate across very different spaces. Sound can travel far beyond the body that produces it. A frightened call can reach someone who is not looking, someone hidden behind an obstacle, or someone standing at a distance. Visible tears cannot do this. They are small, silent, and dependent on light, attention, and proximity. Another person usually has to be close enough to notice moisture gathering around the eyes or moving down the cheeks. At first, that limitation seems like a disadvantage. If the purpose of emotional expression were simply to attract help as quickly as possible, a loud voice would appear more effective. Yet human social life does not consist only of emergencies shouted across distance. Much of it occurs face-to-face, in spaces where people already know that someone is present, and the more difficult problem is understanding that person's condition. In those moments, a quiet signal may carry information that a loud alarm does not. Vocal distress can demand attention, while visible tears may alter the meaning of an encounter after attention has already been established. A person sitting beside someone who begins to cry does not need to be summoned from far away. The important change is that the emotional state has become more difficult to miss. Tears can appear while speech continues, while the person remains silent, or even while they are attempting to hide what they feel. They therefore operate within a collection of other signals: gaze, facial muscles, breathing, posture, voice, and the surrounding circumstances. This difference may offer a clue to their place in human evolution. The ancestors of our species inherited vocal communication and distress calling from a much older biological past. They also inherited social attention to faces and bodies. Emotional tearing could have added another layer to those existing systems without replacing any of them. We cannot determine when this happened, or reconstruct the interactions in which it first mattered. Tears disappear almost immediately, leaving no archaeological trace. We should therefore avoid imagining that an ancient human consciously discovered a quieter way to request help. Evolution does not require such intention. Small changes in how existing physiological systems interact can persist when they influence survival or reproduction, directly or indirectly. If visible tears affected the behavior of nearby individuals, even modestly, they could have acquired social consequences over many generations. One proposed possibility is that tears make vulnerability especially apparent during close encounters. Another is that they may reduce perceived aggression or encourage supportive behavior in some circumstances. Modern research gives these ideas some plausibility because people often interpret tearful faces differently from otherwise similar faces without tears. But those present effects cannot prove which pressures mattered in the distant past. The contrast between sound and tears is still useful because it tells us that the two signals need not perform the same job. A loud cry can announce that something is wrong. A tearful face may help another person judge how deeply something is affecting the individual standing nearby. Human beings became increasingly dependent on close social relationships, prolonged caregiving, cooperation, and the ability to read subtle changes in others. We cannot assign specific emotions to prehistoric people from archaeological evidence, but we can recognize that social information would have mattered within such relationships. The face offered a surface on which that information could appear. Tears made one part of that surface unusually visible. Their silence may therefore be less of a weakness than it first appears. A signal meant for someone already close does not need to travel across a landscape. It only needs to change what that person sees. Emotional tears may belong to this intimate scale of communication, where the difference between being noticed and being understood can matter more than the difference between silence and sound. That possibility brings us closer to an explanation, but not to certainty, because the first emotional tears left no record telling us who saw them or what happened afterward. The farther we look into human origins, the more carefully we have to separate what the past can preserve from what it can never show us directly. Bones can survive, teeth can survive, stone tools can remain where they were dropped or buried, hearths can leave traces of burning, and injuries can sometimes be recognized long after the body itself has disappeared. From evidence like this, researchers can cautiously reconstruct aspects of movement, diet, technology, physical stress, and social life. Emotional tears belong to a very different category. A tear exists for moments, then evaporates, drains away, or disappears into the ground. It leaves no recognizable fossil and no mark that can tell an archaeologist whether a particular ancient person cried after pain, separation, fear, relief, or loss. Even an exceptionally preserved skeleton cannot reveal whether its owner's eyes once filled with tears because of emotion. This simple limitation places a hard boundary around the history we are trying to understand. We cannot identify the first human ancestor who shed emotional tears. We cannot name the population in which the behavior first became common. We cannot watch another individual respond to that face and determine whether the tears brought care, reduced aggression, strengthened attachment, or produced no response at all. Any story that presents such moments as known events would be creating detail that the evidence does not contain. Yet the absence of preserved tears does not mean that science has nothing to say. It means that the problem has to be approached indirectly. Living humans allow researchers to study tear production, nervous activity, development, facial perception, social reactions, and the situations in which crying occurs. Other animals allow comparisons with older systems of eye protection, distress, vocalization, attachment, and social behavior. Archaeology contributes a broader picture of human dependence and cooperation without revealing the emotional expressions exchanged in individual encounters. These different lines of evidence can constrain plausible explanations, even though they cannot recover the original moment. One example shows why caution matters. Archaeologists sometimes find individuals who survive serious injury or physical impairment for long enough that some form of assistance may have been important. Such evidence can support careful arguments about social support in certain populations. It cannot tell us who provided that support, what emotions were present, or whether anyone cried. A healed bone is evidence of biological survival, not a preserved record of compassion. The distinction protects the history of human emotion from becoming a story built mostly from imagination. It also reveals something important about the mystery of crying. Emotional tears may have appeared in a social world whose broad outlines can be studied, but the behavior itself occupied a scale of time and intimacy that archaeology rarely captures. A wet face seen by another person may have changed an interaction lasting only seconds. Evolution, however, can act through the accumulated consequences of countless small interactions across generations. If tears affected how others responded often enough, their influence could matter, even though every individual signal vanished almost immediately. This is one reason the evolutionary history of crying remains difficult to reconstruct. The evidence we most want is the evidence least capable of surviving. We can examine the result in modern humans and ask what functions emotional tears perform now. We can test whether people judge a tearful face differently. We can study how crying changes across development and social circumstances. From these observations, hypotheses about caregiving, vulnerability, bonding, conflict, or emotional regulation can be evaluated, but none can be converted automatically into a factual account of prehistoric behavior. Somewhere in the history of the human lineage, the nervous system became capable of linking certain emotional states with visible tearing in the form familiar to us today. Beyond that general statement, the chronology remains uncertain. We do not know whether the connection developed gradually, whether its social consequences changed over time, or whether several different advantages contributed to its persistence. The silence of the archaeological record is therefore not an empty space to fill with confident stories. It is evidence of the limits of what can be recovered. Those limits matter because they keep the central question open. We know that human beings today can transform an invisible emotional state into visible moisture on the face, and we know that other people can respond to that signal. What we cannot recover is the chain of ancient encounters through which this relationship between emotion, eyes, and social attention became established. The first emotional tears disappeared almost as soon as they were shed, taking their immediate history with them. Loss, separation, and powerlessness appear again and again in human crying, but they do not form a simple rule that explains every tear. A person may cry when someone dies, when a relationship ends, when a child leaves home, when an expected future disappears, or when circumstances cannot be changed despite every effort. In these moments, the body is not necessarily responding to immediate physical injury. The eyes may be healthy, the surroundings may be safe, and there may be no danger that can be escaped by running or fighting. Instead, the emotional system is responding to a change in relationships, expectations, memory, or control. And this is one reason emotional tears remain so difficult to explain. Through ordinary ideas about survival, many biological responses to danger prepare the body to act. Muscles tighten, attention narrows, breathing changes, and energy can be redirected toward movement. Yet grief often presents a problem for which movement provides no solution. The person who has died cannot be brought back by greater strength. An irreversible separation cannot always be repaired by immediate action, and a major loss can continue to affect the nervous system long after the event itself has ended. Crying frequently appears in exactly these kinds of situations, where the importance of the event is enormous, but the ability to change it is limited. This does not prove that emotional tears evolved as a response to powerlessness, because people also cry in circumstances where they are not helpless, and many moments of helplessness occur without tears, but the association gives us an important clue. Human emotional life is deeply connected to attachment, and attachment creates both benefits and vulnerabilities. Forming stable relationships can provide care, cooperation, learning, protection, and companionship. Yet the same relationship that supports a person can become a source of intense distress when it is threatened or lost. These patterns have roots deeper than modern society. Many social mammals respond strongly to separation from caregivers or companions, and young animals often produce distress calls when isolated. Human beings inherited this older biological connection between attachment and separation, but emotional tears appear to add something distinctive to it. They allow the consequences of separation to become visible on the face, even when no vocal call is necessary. We cannot know when this connection appeared in the human lineage, because neither grief nor tears fossilize, and archaeological evidence cannot tell us what an individual felt while sitting beside an injured or dying companion. Caution is especially important here because evidence of burial, long-term care, or social cooperation does not automatically prove that ancient people experienced or expressed grief in exactly the same ways as people today. What can be said more securely is that human survival developed within increasingly complex networks of dependence and repeated social relationships, making the loss of important individuals potentially consequential both emotionally and practically, Modern crying gives us a window into how strongly these relationships can affect the body. A memory of someone absent can alter breathing, facial muscles, autonomic activity, and tear production even when the remembered person is nowhere nearby. This means the immediate trigger for crying does not have to exist in the physical environment. The brain can reconstruct a relationship, compare the present with what once existed, recognize an absence, and produce a bodily response to that difference. The same principle may help explain tears associated with failure, rejection, or situations in which a desired outcome has become impossible. But no single category captures all of them, because emotional crying also appears when separation ends rather than begins. A person can cry during reunion, when someone believed lost returns, or when uncertainty finally resolves safely. This apparent contradiction tells us that tears may not encode loss itself. They may instead accompany moments when an attachment-related state becomes unusually intense, difficult to regulate, or impossible to express fully through ordinary speech. Even that remains a working possibility rather than a settled explanation, because crying varies greatly among individuals and circumstances. Some people remain dry-eyed during profound grief, while others cry during relatively brief emotional experiences. Biology, personality, social expectations, and immediate context all influence what happens. The evolutionary importance of loss and separation, therefore, lies not in giving us a final answer, but in revealing the kind of human problem tears often accompany, a problem in which another person matters deeply. The event cannot always be changed, and the body makes that internal disruption visible. Somewhere in the long development of the human lineage, a system that once served the surface of the eye became capable of responding to the invisible fact that someone important was gone, distant, unreachable, or suddenly present again, and that strange connection between attachment and water on the face remains one of the strongest clues to why emotional crying became part of being human. Human beings do not cry only when something has gone wrong, and this fact complicates almost every simple explanation of emotional tears. A person can begin to cry when a loved one returns safely, when a long period of uncertainty finally ends, when an exhausted effort succeeds, when forgiveness arrives, or when a deeply meaningful experience becomes difficult to contain. The tears may look almost identical to those produced by grief, yet the emotional situation is completely different. This is important, because if tears were nothing more than a biological signal of sadness, positive experiences should not produce them so readily. Instead, the same lacrimal system can become active during emotional states that seem to point in opposite directions: sorrow and joy, loss and reunion, fear and relief. This does not mean that all these experiences are biologically identical. They are not. But they may share something more general. They can create a level of emotional arousal or significance that becomes difficult to regulate through ordinary expression alone. Researchers sometimes describe such moments as being emotionally moved or overwhelmed. Although there is no single agreed explanation that accounts for every case, the body may be responding not simply to whether an event is good or bad, but to the intensity, meaning, and sudden change associated with it. Consider relief after danger has passed. During the threat itself, attention may remain focused on action, decisions, and immediate survival. When safety finally becomes clear, the body can shift rapidly from sustained tension toward release. Tears sometimes appear during that transition. Similarly, reunion can combine joy with the memory of separation, and gratitude can carry both pleasure and recognition of vulnerability. These mixed emotional states show why it is difficult to assign tears a single message. The visible fluid does not tell an observer whether the person has gained something or lost something. Context has to provide that meaning. This may be one reason tears are so closely tied to the human face rather than functioning as a simple alarm. The face, voice, posture, and surrounding event work together, while the tears may signal that the emotional importance of the moment has become unusually high. Such a possibility also connects back to the origins of our species. Without requiring an invented prehistoric story, human emotional life developed within social relationships, in which separation, reunion, dependence, uncertainty, and cooperation could all matter. We cannot know whether early members of the human lineage cried with relief after a companion returned, or with joy after a danger ended. Because these experiences leave no direct archaeological trace, what we can say is that modern humans possess a nervous system capable of transforming both negative and positive emotional intensity into visible tearing, and that this response is deeply intertwined with social meaning. Tears of joy are therefore not an exception that can be ignored. They are evidence against the idea that crying exists only to advertise suffering. They suggest that the trigger may be broader than pain or helplessness alone, perhaps involving rapid changes in emotional state, powerful attachment, or moments when competing feelings are present at the same time. But these remain hypotheses rather than settled conclusions. Crying also varies widely among individuals. Some people cry easily during joyful events while others rarely do. Culture, personality, learned expectations, and immediate circumstances influence whether tears appear and how they are interpreted. This variation again warns us not to treat tears as a fixed code. What remains consistent is that the body can use the same visible response in moments of profound loss and profound happiness, which means the evolutionary puzzle cannot be solved by asking only why sadness produces tears. We must ask why intense human meaning of several different kinds can reach the eyes at all. The paradox of joyful crying therefore deepens the mystery, because the same water that appears when something precious is gone can also appear when something precious has been restored. The fact that people can cry from grief, relief, reunion, frustration, gratitude, fear, tenderness, and joy suggests that emotional tears may not belong to any single feeling. Sadness is one of their most familiar companions, but it cannot explain the whole pattern, because the same eyes that fill after losing someone can also fill when someone returns. The same body that cries after defeat can cry when years of effort finally succeed. And the same tears that appear during loneliness can appear when a person suddenly feels deeply connected to another human being. This wide range forces us to look for something broader than a simple relationship between tears and negative emotion. One possibility is that crying becomes more likely when emotional experience reaches a level that is difficult to regulate through ordinary speech, facial expression, or deliberate control. People often describe such moments as overwhelming, but that word should not be treated as a complete biological explanation. It simply points toward a shared feature among experiences that otherwise look very different. A powerful event can alter attention, breathing, muscle tension, autonomic activity, memory, and the ability to speak normally, and emotional tears may appear within that larger bodily state. What matters may be not whether the event is pleasant or painful, but how strongly it changes the person's internal condition. This helps explain why opposite emotions sometimes produce similar outward results. Relief can follow fear, reunion can follow separation, gratitude can contain an awareness of dependence, and joy can arrive after a period of uncertainty. The emotional experience is therefore often not a single clean feeling, but a transition between states. The nervous system is responding to what has happened, what was expected, what almost happened, and what the event means for relationships and future possibilities. Humans are especially capable of creating these responses from events that are not physically present. A memory can bring tears years after the original experience. An imagined future can produce them before anything has occurred. Music can evoke associations without presenting a direct threat or reward, and a few words can reactivate an attachment that has existed for decades. This ability connects emotional crying to a distinctive feature of human life. Our bodies can respond not only to immediate physical conditions, but to meanings constructed from memory, expectation, language, and relationships. We should not turn this observation into a claim that complex thought caused tears to evolve, because the evolutionary sequence cannot be recovered directly. The earliest emotional tears left no fossil record, and we cannot determine whether they first appeared in response to separation, pain, social conflict, reunion, or some other state. Yet modern crying shows that the connection between emotion and the tear system is broad enough to cross many categories. This makes simple evolutionary stories less convincing. If tears were only a request for help, joyful crying would require additional explanation. If they were only a sign of sadness, relief would not fit comfortably. If they existed only to reduce aggression, tears shed alone would be difficult to understand. And if they were simply a mechanism for releasing emotional pressure, we would still need to explain why the response takes this particular visible form and why it influences observers. None of these difficulties proves that existing hypotheses are wrong. Instead, they suggest that emotional crying may involve several functions and several pathways at once. The behavior can influence internal regulation while also communicating information. It can have different effects depending on context, and its social meaning can change as culture develops around it. The human lineage did not begin with a single emotional system waiting for tears to be attached. It inherited ancient mechanisms for attachment: distress, arousal, eye protection, vocalization, and social perception. Over time, these systems may have become linked in ways that allowed a wide range of powerful experiences to reach the lacrimal glands. Exactly how that happened remains unknown, but the result is visible in modern life. Tears do not tell us what someone is feeling with precision. They tell us that something important is happening. Another person still has to read the face, hear the voice, understand the relationship, and know the surrounding event. This may be why emotional tears can accompany both the worst and some of the best moments of human life. They are not a label attached to sadness. They are part of a bodily response that appears when meaning, attachment, memory, and emotion become strong enough to cross from the invisible world of experience into the visible surface of the face. For a long time, people have described crying as a kind of emotional release, as though feelings accumulate inside the body until tears provide a way for them to escape. The idea is familiar because it often seems to match experience. Someone may endure grief, frustration, fear, or tension for hours and then begin to cry, and afterward the emotional pressure may seem lower. This has encouraged the belief that crying itself cleanses the mind or removes something harmful from the body. In everyday language, people may say that they needed to let everything out. Yet scientific research gives a more complicated picture. Crying does not reliably make every person feel better, and the presence of tears does not function like a simple valve that empties emotion. Some people report relief afterward, while others feel unchanged or even worse, particularly when the crying occurs in an unsupportive, embarrassing, or stressful situation. The difference matters because the experience of relief can easily be mistaken for proof of a biological function. Feeling better after crying does not necessarily mean that tears themselves cause the improvement. Many things can change at the same time. The stressful event may have ended. Another person may have offered comfort. The individual may have stopped resisting an emotion, rested, changed breathing, or gained a new understanding of what happened. Crying occurs inside this larger sequence rather than in isolation. Researchers have therefore questioned simple versions of the catharsis idea. There is no strong basis for imagining that emotional tears remove a special collection of harmful emotional substances from the body. Tears certainly contain biological compounds, as all bodily fluids do, but their presence does not establish that crying evolved as a chemical disposal system for psychological stress. This distinction becomes important when we return to human origins. Our ancestors already possessed mechanisms for regulating physiological arousal long before emotional tearing appeared in the form recognized today. Breathing, hormonal responses, autonomic activity, sleep, social contact, movement, and recovery after threat all participate in restoring bodily balance. If crying contributes to regulation, it would be one element within a much older and more complicated system rather than a unique drain through which emotion leaves the body. We cannot know whether prehistoric humans felt calmer after crying, because subjective relief leaves no archaeological evidence. Any claim that an ancient person cried in order to release emotional pressure would therefore go beyond what can be demonstrated. Modern research is more useful when it asks narrower questions. How does mood change before and after crying? Does the social setting matter? Does receiving comfort alter the outcome? Does the person feel ashamed of crying or accepted by those nearby? Findings from such work suggest that context strongly influences what happens afterward. Crying in the presence of supportive people may be followed by a different emotional course from crying during rejection, conflict, or isolation. Even the timing of measurement matters, because the immediate experience of crying can be unpleasant, while later reflection may feel more relieving. This helps explain why personal memories of crying often differ from what laboratory studies observe during the event itself. The old idea of catharsis is therefore not completely useless, because it captures the genuine experience that some people feel better after tears. The problem begins when that experience is turned into a universal biological law. Human crying appears too variable for that. Sometimes tears accompany recovery, sometimes they accompany continuing distress, and sometimes they seem to change little at all. The same person may experience crying differently at different moments of life. This complexity brings us again to the central evolutionary puzzle. If tears do not reliably improve the internal state of the person producing them, perhaps their persistence cannot be explained by internal relief alone. We must continue looking beyond the crying body toward the circumstances surrounding it, especially the presence or absence of other people. The feeling that follows a tear may depend not only on what leaves the eye, but on what happens in the human world after the tear becomes visible. People often remember crying as a moment after which something changed, but the direction of that change is not always the same. Some people feel calmer, some feel exhausted, some feel embarrassed, and some remain just as distressed as before. This variability is important because it tells us that crying cannot be understood as a guaranteed mechanism for emotional relief. The body may produce tears during intense emotion, but what happens afterward depends on far more than the tears themselves. Researchers studying crying have found that mood can be influenced by the situation, the presence of supportive people, the reason for crying, the person's expectations, and the amount of time that has passed since the event. Crying in front of someone who responds with warmth may be followed by a sense of comfort, while crying during conflict, rejection, or humiliation may deepen discomfort instead. Even crying alone can have different effects depending on whether the person feels safe, ashamed, overwhelmed, or able to reflect on what happened. This is one reason studies conducted in laboratories do not always produce the same results as people's memories of crying in everyday life. The immediate experience may involve tension, sadness, irregular breathing, and physical fatigue, while a later memory of the same event may emphasize the relief that came after the situation changed. The distinction matters when we ask why humans evolved emotional tears. If crying reliably restored the body to a better state, an internal regulation explanation would become much stronger. But the evidence is not that simple. Some physiological changes associated with crying may participate in recovery from emotional arousal, yet no single process has been shown to explain why tears themselves are necessary. The person may calm because the threat has ended, because breathing changes, because another person offers support, because attention shifts, or because time passes. Tears occur within this larger sequence. Rather than acting as a separate medicine produced by the eyes, this becomes especially important when we look toward human origins. Our ancestors already possessed ancient systems for recovering after stress, including autonomic adjustments, rest, sleep, social contact, and changes in behavior. Emotional tearing appeared within that broader regulatory machinery, but no archaeological evidence can tell us whether an ancient individual felt better after crying, nor can we reconstruct the private emotional consequences of a specific prehistoric event. The most responsible approach is therefore to use modern evidence carefully. And modern evidence points toward context. A person who receives understanding after crying may experience the event very differently from someone whose tears are mocked or ignored. This suggests that at least some of the relief associated with crying may come through social pathways. If tears make distress more visible, and another person responds with comfort, reassurance, protection, or simple presence, then the emotional state of the crier may change, not because fluid has left the eye, but because the social environment has changed. This possibility connects crying back to the long human dependence on other people. A signal that influences the behavior of others can indirectly influence the internal state of the person who produced it. Yet even this should not be treated as a complete explanation. People sometimes cry when alone and still report relief, while others receive support and remain deeply distressed. Emotional crying is therefore unlikely to be controlled by one universal outcome. It may involve several overlapping processes whose importance differs from one situation to another. What remains clear is that feeling better after crying is not automatic, and that fact weakens any theory claiming tears evolved simply to release emotional pressure. The more careful conclusion is that crying changes the conditions surrounding an emotional episode, sometimes inside the body, sometimes between people, and sometimes both. Whether those changes lead to relief depends on what happens before, during, and after the tears appear, which means the evolutionary value of crying may lie not in one guaranteed feeling, but in a flexible response, embedded within the larger social and biological life of humans. The relief that sometimes follows crying may begin not with the tears themselves, but with what happens around them. Because emotional crying rarely occurs as an isolated biological event, it happens inside a sequence of thoughts, bodily changes, relationships, and social responses. A person may be struggling to speak, trying to remain composed, remembering a loss, waiting for news, or facing a situation that feels impossible to control. Then tears appear, and from that moment the behavior of other people may change. Someone may move closer, lower their voice, stop arguing, offer physical comfort, listen more carefully, or simply remain present. These responses can alter the emotional environment in which the crying began, and that alteration may contribute to the feeling of relief that sometimes comes later. This possibility helps explain why crying can feel different depending on whether it is accepted or rejected. If tears are met with support, the person may no longer feel alone with the emotion. If they are mocked, ignored, or treated as weakness, the same physiological response may be followed by shame, anger, or greater distress. The contrast suggests that part of the effect of crying may emerge through interaction rather than through the chemical composition of tears. This is consistent with the broader social nature of human emotional life. People regulate emotion not only through processes inside their own bodies, but also through the presence, attention, and behavior of others. A child who is frightened may calm when held. An adult under stress may feel safer when another person listens, and someone facing loss may experience a small reduction in isolation when grief is recognized. Emotional tears can make that need or emotional intensity more visible, and visibility can change what happens next. This does not mean that humans consciously evolved crying as a way to obtain comfort, nor does it mean that every episode of crying is a request for help. Many people cry alone, some hide their tears, and some do not want anyone to approach them. The function of emotional crying is unlikely to be reducible to one intention, yet the possibility that tears alter social surroundings remains important because human beings have always depended heavily on other human beings. From early childhood through adulthood, our species relies on cooperation, care, shared attention, communication, and long relationships. These patterns did not suddenly appear in modern society. Although their exact forms in prehistoric populations cannot be reconstructed with certainty, the deeper history of the human lineage was already shaped by social dependence. And within such a setting, a signal that made distress easier to recognize could influence outcomes. We cannot know whether an ancient individual felt calmer because another person saw tears and responded with comfort. No archaeological trace can preserve that sequence, but modern evidence allows us to examine the same general process today. When people see tears, they may judge the crier as more vulnerable or in greater need of support, and supportive responses can influence emotional recovery. This creates a possible chain in which an internal state produces visible tears. The tears influence another person. The other person changes behavior, and that changed social environment then affects the original crier. If such a loop occurs, the benefit is not contained inside the tear itself. It emerges across two or more people. This idea is especially useful because it explains why emotional crying can be both biological and social at the same time. The lacrimal glands are physical structures, the nervous pathways are biological, the emotion is experienced by one individual, but the meaning of the tears can be completed by another mind. The same principle may also help explain why crying sometimes provides no relief at all if no supportive response follows, or if the underlying problem remains unchanged. The emotional state may continue despite the tears. Nothing has been chemically washed away from the mind, and no automatic reset has occurred. Relief is therefore better understood as a possible outcome of a larger process rather than as the guaranteed purpose of crying. This broader view also brings us closer to the origin of human emotional tears, without pretending that the answer is settled. A system that began as part of eye protection may have become connected to emotional arousal, and once that connection produced a visible face that influenced other humans, new social consequences became possible. Some of those consequences may have helped strengthen attachment, encourage care, or reduce isolation, while others may simply have become woven into the complex ways humans interpret one another. What matters is that the emotional episode does not end at the eyelid. A tear can move outward into a relationship, and the feeling that follows may depend as much on the response of another person as on anything happening inside the eye itself. Human beings share the capacity for emotional tears, but they do not all cry in the same way. Some people cry often while others rarely do. Some become tearful during grief but remain dry-eyed during pain. Others cry more readily during relief, conflict, tenderness, or exhaustion, and even the same person can respond differently to similar events at different times of life. This variation is important because it prevents us from imagining emotional crying as a rigid reflex with one predictable trigger. Unlike the reflex tearing caused by smoke or irritation, emotional tears depend on a much larger network of influences, including temperament, current stress, social setting, learned expectations, relationships, and the meaning a person gives to an event. Biological differences also matter, and studies have reported average differences in crying frequency between groups such as men and women, but those patterns overlap greatly and cannot be reduced to a simple rule about sex or personality. Culture can strengthen or weaken those differences by teaching people when tears are acceptable, embarrassing, admirable, private, or inappropriate. This means that the human ability to cry is biological, while the situations in which crying is expressed are partly shaped by experience. A child learns not only language and social behavior, but also how people around them react to visible emotion. If tears are comforted, ignored, criticized, or hidden by adults, those experiences may influence how openly that child expresses crying later. None of this changes the basic fact that emotional tearing is a human bodily capacity, but it changes how often that capacity becomes visible. This distinction matters when we look back toward human origins, because evolution can provide a biological possibility without determining every future expression of it. The human lineage may have developed the neural connection that allows emotion to activate tear production. While different communities later created different rules around when those tears should be shown, we cannot reconstruct those ancient rules directly. Since social expectations do not fossilize and emotional displays leave almost no durable trace, archaeology can reveal patterns of settlement, cooperation, burial, injury, and material culture, but it cannot tell us whether a particular population encouraged adults to cry openly or expected them to conceal tears. Any confident claim about such details would go beyond the evidence. Modern variation therefore offers a safer lesson. Emotional crying is flexible, and flexibility may be one reason it became so deeply woven into human social life. A signal that always meant exactly one thing would be easier to interpret but less adaptable. Tears can accompany sadness, relief, gratitude, frustration, reunion, pain, or experiences that combine several emotions. And different people may reach tears at different levels of intensity. The observer must therefore read the whole situation rather than the fluid alone. This makes crying less like an automatic alarm and more like one element in a larger communication system. The same tearful face may be interpreted differently depending on who is watching, what happened before, and what relationship exists between the people involved. This variability also complicates evolutionary explanations. If crying served only one narrow purpose, we might expect a more uniform pattern. Instead, we find a behavior that is shaped by biology, development, personality, and social learning at the same time. That does not mean emotional tears have no evolved function. It means any function has to be compatible with a wide range of human contexts. Perhaps tears became useful because they made intense internal states more visible without prescribing a single response. Perhaps they interacted with caregiving, attachment, conflict reduction, or social bonding in different ways, or perhaps several of these effects mattered across different periods and relationships. The available evidence does not allow one of these possibilities to be declared the sole answer. What it does show is that emotional crying is not identical from person to person. The capacity is shared, but the threshold, frequency, meaning, and social display vary. And that variation reminds us that evolution gave humans a body capable of producing emotional tears, while culture and individual history help determine when the world actually sees them. A human being does not learn how to produce emotional tears in the same way that a child learns a language. Yet people do learn when those tears should be shown, hidden, apologized for, or accepted. From early childhood, reactions from parents, relatives, teachers, friends, and communities can shape the meaning attached to crying. One child may be comforted quickly when tears appear, another may be encouraged to become quiet, and another may learn that visible emotion is acceptable only in certain situations. Over time, these responses become part of the social environment surrounding a biological capacity that already exists. This is why two people experiencing similar emotions may behave very differently in public. One may allow tears to remain visible, while another turns away, lowers the head, leaves the room, or deliberately controls the face until privacy becomes available. Such differences do not mean that one person feels more deeply than the other, because the absence of tears cannot be used as a reliable measure of emotional intensity. People vary in how readily they cry, how strongly they try to suppress crying, and how comfortable they feel when another person sees it. Social expectations can influence all of these choices. Ideas about age, gender, status, responsibility, strength, dignity, and appropriate behavior can shape whether tears are interpreted as understandable, embarrassing, moving, weak, sincere, or disruptive. These meanings are not identical across cultures or historical periods, and even within one society, different families and social groups may teach different rules. This flexibility is important for the evolutionary question, because it separates the biological ability to cry from the cultural regulation of that ability. Evolution did not need to determine one universal rule saying, when a person must shed tears. It only needed to produce a nervous system in which emotional states could sometimes activate the tear system. Once that capacity existed, human communities could build expectations around it, just as cultures build expectations around voice, posture, touch, clothing, mourning, and many other forms of expression. We cannot know what the earliest cultural rules surrounding emotional tears were, because rules about display leave little direct archaeological evidence. A grave can tell us that a body was treated in a particular way, but it cannot tell us whether mourners cried openly, remained silent, or followed conventions that no longer exist. Images and written accounts from later societies can sometimes reveal attitudes toward crying. But even those sources must be interpreted carefully because artistic and literary conventions do not record every ordinary emotional behavior. The farther we move toward human origins, the more uncertain such details become. What modern research does show is that social context influences how comfortable people feel about crying and how observers respond when tears are visible. This means that emotional tears operate at the meeting point of biology and learned social meaning. The fluid comes from the body, but its interpretation belongs partly to culture. A person may feel tears beginning and immediately decide whether to resist them because they have learned what crying is supposed to mean in that setting. Another person watching may judge the same tears through a different set of expectations. This helps explain why emotional crying can never be reduced to a simple universal code. Tears do not automatically mean sadness, weakness, honesty, or a request for help. They become meaningful through the face, the situation, the relationship, and the social rules surrounding the encounter. Yet culture alone cannot solve the deeper mystery, because cultural expectations can explain why people display or suppress tears differently. But they do not explain why human emotion gained access to the lacrimal system in the first place. Before any society could teach a child whether crying was acceptable, the biological capacity had to exist. Somewhere in the history of our lineage, emotion became capable of producing visible tears, and later generations built customs around that response. This distinction allows us to keep two questions separate. One concerns how humans learn to manage crying, and the other concerns why humans possess emotional crying at all. The first can change rapidly between communities and generations, while the second reaches much deeper into our evolutionary past. Culture can teach us when to hide the tears, but it did not create the ancient biological connection that makes hiding them necessary. Culture can shape when people cry, where they cry, who is allowed to see them, and what those tears are thought to mean. But culture does not by itself explain why the human body can produce emotional tears in the first place. This distinction becomes essential once we try to separate the recent history of social rules from the much older history of human biology. Every society develops expectations about emotional expression. Some situations encourage visible grief, others reward restraint. Some communities may accept tears during mourning or reunion, while discouraging them in public conflict. And individuals learn these expectations through observation, correction, imitation, and experience. As a result, two people with similar emotional reactions may display them very differently. One may cry openly while another suppresses tears until privacy becomes available. Neither response tells us with certainty how strongly the person feels, because social regulation can alter expression without removing the underlying emotion. This flexibility can sometimes create the impression that crying itself is mainly cultural, but that conclusion goes too far. Culture can influence the threshold at which tears are shown and the meaning observers assign to them. Yet the capacity for emotion to activate the lacrimal system depends on biological pathways that must already exist. A child does not need to be taught how to make the lacrimal glands respond to intense emotion in the same deliberate way that the child must be taught vocabulary or social customs. What is learned is largely how to manage the response once it becomes possible. This difference helps us return to the deeper history of our species. The human lineage developed within social environments long before written rules, formal institutions, or recorded traditions existed, but we cannot recover the precise emotional expectations of those populations. Archaeological remains may show repeated burial practices, care for injured individuals, shared living spaces, or patterns of cooperation. Yet none of these tells us whether people were expected to cry openly, silently, privately, or not at all. The emotional rules of prehistoric communities disappeared with the people who practiced them, and any confident reconstruction would exceed the evidence. What we can say is that once emotional tears existed, they entered social worlds capable of assigning meaning to them. Over generations, those meanings could change. A tear might be interpreted as grief in one context, weakness in another, sincerity in another, or simply as a private response that should not be displayed publicly. This cultural flexibility may help explain why modern crying is so variable, without requiring us to imagine that the underlying biological capacity differs completely from one population to another. It also reveals why cultural explanation cannot close the central question of the video. Even if every social rule surrounding crying were mapped perfectly, we would still need to ask why emotion can reach the eyes at all. Humans already possessed other ways to communicate distress, including vocalization, facial movement, posture, touch, and language, and culture can regulate all of these as well. Yet emotional tears remain unusual because they recruit a system originally involved in maintaining and protecting the eye. The fact that societies later built meanings around that response tells us that tears became socially important, but it does not reveal how the original connection emerged. Evolution and culture therefore operate on different timescales. In this story, biological evolution produced a nervous system capable of emotional tearing, while cultural evolution helped determine when that capacity would be displayed, concealed, valued, or criticized. The two processes interact, because social expectations can influence behavior across a lifetime, but they should not be confused. A person who learns never to cry in public still possesses the same basic pathway that can produce tears in private. And a society that encourages visible mourning does not create the lacrimal system from nothing. It works with an inherited human capacity. This leaves us with a useful boundary. Culture can explain variation in expression much better than it can explain origin. It can tell us why one person hides tears while another allows them to fall, but it cannot tell us why the human lineage became capable of emotional tears before those social rules were ever taught. The original mystery, therefore, remains where it began, somewhere in our evolutionary past. Emotion gained reliable access to the eyes, and culture arrived later to decide what those visible drops were supposed to mean. By the time we reach the question of why humans cry emotional tears, several explanations remain standing. but none has earned the right to become the single answer. One possibility is that tears act as social signals of distress, making an internal state easier for another person to recognize. This fits with experiments showing that tearful faces are often judged as sadder, more vulnerable, or more in need of support than the same faces without visible tears. Another possibility is that tears help reduce perceived threat, because a person whose eyes are wet and whose face is visibly distressed may appear less aggressive or less prepared for confrontation. A related idea is that tears can invite caregiving, especially in close relationships, where another person can see the face clearly. These proposals overlap rather than compete completely, because a signal of vulnerability could at the same time reduce aggression and increase the chance of support, yet none can be treated as a proven account of origin. Modern social effects do not automatically reveal the evolutionary pressure that first strengthened the connection between emotion and the lacrimal system. Another family of explanations focuses on bonding. Emotional tears may contribute to moments in which people become more attentive to one another, respond with comfort, or recognize that an experience has become unusually intense. This is plausible in a species whose survival has long depended on prolonged caregiving, cooperation, and repeated social relationships. But the archaeological record cannot show whether tears themselves strengthened those bonds in prehistoric populations. Some researchers have also considered whether crying contributes to internal regulation, perhaps by participating in shifts in autonomic activity after intense arousal. But the common idea that tears simply release emotional pressure is too simple. People do not always feel better after crying, and the outcome depends strongly on context, social response, timing, and the event itself. This suggests that any regulatory effect may be only one element of a larger process rather than the primary purpose of tears. The same caution applies to the idea that crying communicates helplessness. Many episodes occur when a person cannot change what has happened, during loss, separation, failure, or overwhelming circumstances. Yet humans also cry during reunion, relief, gratitude, and joy. So, helplessness alone cannot account for the whole range. The broader pattern may involve moments when emotion becomes difficult to contain, or when an experience carries unusually high personal meaning, but that remains a description of when tears often appear. Not an explanation of why evolution linked emotion to the eyes. What survives after these possibilities are compared is not one elegant theory, but a cluster of functions that may operate together. Tears can alter how another person reads a face, make vulnerability more visible, change the course of close social interaction, and accompany shifts out of intense arousal. None of these effects requires the others to be false. Evolution often preserves traits that have several consequences at once, and the function of a trait can shift over time as environments and relationships change. This may be especially relevant to human crying because the biological components involved were already old. Eyes already needed tears, nervous systems already responded to emotion, faces already carried social information, and vocal distress already existed. Emotional tearing may have emerged through a new coordination among these older systems rather than through the invention of a completely new structure, but the sequence is hidden from direct observation. We do not know whether caregiving came first, whether reduced aggression mattered more, whether close-range signaling was central, or whether several small advantages accumulated together. The most scientifically responsible conclusion is therefore not that nobody has any explanation, but that several serious explanations exist, and none has yet closed the case. Emotional tears remain unusual because every surviving hypothesis explains some of what crying does while leaving another part unresolved, and that is exactly why the question at the center of human crying still remains open. Science can describe emotional crying with far greater precision than it can explain its beginning, and the difference between those two kinds of knowledge is important. Researchers can observe people while they cry, measure changes in tear production, examine activity within neural systems involved in emotion and autonomic regulation, compare tearful and non-tearful faces, and ask observers how those faces influence their judgments. Developmental research can examine how crying changes from infancy through adulthood. Comparative biology can show that many animals produce tears for eye maintenance, while emotional tearing in the familiar human sense has not been firmly established as a regular behavior in other species. These lines of evidence give us a strong description of the phenomenon that exists today. Emotional states can recruit the human tear system. Visible tears can influence social perception. Crying occurs across several kinds of emotion rather than sadness alone, and the experience that follows crying varies greatly depending on circumstances. What science cannot do is travel backward and observe the evolutionary transitions that connected these systems. This limitation becomes especially important when people ask when the first human cried emotional tears, because there is no preserved evidence capable of identifying such a moment. Tears evaporate, neural activity disappears, and emotional experiences leave no direct fossil signature. Even if researchers recover an ancient human skull in excellent condition, the bones cannot reveal whether the individual once cried after separation, reunion, pain, fear, or grief. The structures that supported tear production may leave anatomical clues about the eyes and face, but anatomy alone cannot demonstrate the emotional situations in which those structures were activated. This means that the history of crying must be reconstructed indirectly, through patterns that exist in living organisms and through broader knowledge of human evolution. Such reconstruction is normal in evolutionary science. Many behaviors cannot be observed directly in extinct populations, but the uncertainty must remain visible rather than being replaced with invented detail. We can reasonably say that human ancestors inherited old systems for eye lubrication, autonomic regulation, attachment, vocal distress, and social perception. We can also say that modern humans possess an unusual connection between strong emotion and visible tearing. What lies between these observations is a historical sequence that has not been preserved. Perhaps small changes in neural regulation allowed emotional arousal to increase tear production more reliably. Perhaps those visible tears then influenced nearby individuals in ways that affected care, conflict, or attachment. Perhaps several consequences became important at different times. These possibilities can be evaluated for plausibility, but none can be watched directly in the populations where the behavior emerged. Archaeology contributes valuable context, while also showing the boundary of what can be known. Evidence of long-term care for injured individuals, cooperative activity, repeated occupation, food sharing, or burial practices may reveal aspects of social life. Yet none of these discoveries can tell us whether tears were present during a particular interaction. A healed injury does not preserve the expression of the caregiver, and a grave does not preserve the emotional response of the people who placed the body there. The temptation to fill those silences with familiar modern feelings is strong, but doing so would turn inference into storytelling. The safer approach is to allow the silence to remain, because uncertainty itself contains information about the limits of evidence. Modern experiments provide another boundary. If people today respond more strongly to a face when tears are visible, that demonstrates a current social effect, it does not prove that the same effect was the original reason emotional crying evolved. Traits can acquire new functions after they arise. Social environments can change, and culture can reshape how biological signals are interpreted. Even a consistent present-day response cannot simply be projected backward across thousands of generations. This is why no single experiment can answer the title question. Neuroscience explains pathways, psychology measures perception, anthropology provides social context, developmental research shows how crying changes across life, and evolutionary comparison reveals what humans share with other animals and where the apparent differences lie. Together, these fields narrow the range of reasonable explanations, but they do not produce a preserved origin story. What science knows is therefore substantial. Emotional crying is a genuine biological phenomenon with measurable social effects. It recruits systems that originally served broader physiological functions, and it occurs within a species deeply dependent on communication and relationships. What science cannot recover is the exact historical chain that transformed those older systems into the human pattern visible today. There is no first tear preserved in stone, no ancient nervous system frozen at the moment of grief, and no record of the first observer whose behavior changed after seeing another face become wet. The mystery remains not because nothing is known, but because the most important events happened in bodies and relationships that disappeared without leaving direct traces, leaving modern humans as the living evidence of an evolutionary connection whose beginning can be approached, constrained, and studied, but not completely replayed. A tear begins as water on the surface of an eye, but in human life it can become something much larger, because the moment it appears, another person may see that something inside the body has changed. The observer may not know whether the cause is grief, relief, fear, tenderness, reunion, or joy. Yet a private state has crossed into the visible world, and this may be the most important lesson hidden inside the mystery of crying. Human emotion is not confined to thought. It moves through breathing, muscles, voice, posture, heart activity, and sometimes through tears. The body makes inner experience partly observable, while other people respond to what they see. This creates a bridge between biology and relationship. One nervous system produces the signal, and another interprets it. And whatever evolutionary value emotional tears acquired may have emerged somewhere inside that exchange. Perhaps tears made vulnerability easier to recognize, encouraged care in some situations, reduced conflict in others, or became useful in close relationships where subtle signals mattered. None of these possibilities has been established as the single origin, and there may never have been only one. Evolution often works by modifying old systems and allowing them to acquire several effects. The human eye already needed tears. The nervous system already controlled glands and bodily responses. Social animals already communicated distress, and faces already carried information before emotional tearing appeared in the form familiar to us. Somewhere in the history of the human lineage, these older systems became connected in a way that allowed emotion to reach the eyes, but that historical connection left almost no direct trace, no tear fossilized, no moment of grief entered stone, and no ancient observer recorded how they reacted when another face became wet. The absence of that evidence does not make the phenomenon mysterious in a supernatural sense. It reminds us that some questions about human origins are difficult because the evidence disappears with the behavior itself. Science can still move closer by combining neuroscience, developmental research, comparative biology, psychology, and anthropology. Tears are not merely eye protection, because emotional events can trigger them without irritating the eye. They are not simply sadness, because people cry during joy and relief. They are not guaranteed emotional medicine, because crying does not always make people feel better. And they are not a universal request for help, because people sometimes cry alone or hide their tears from others. What remains is a flexible human response woven into attachment, memory, social perception, bodily regulation, and meaning. The educational value of this question is not that humans possess a strange feature separating us completely from other animals. We share many biological foundations of emotion, attachment, distress, and eye protection with other species. What appears distinctive is the way those older foundations became joined, creating visible emotional tears in humans. Understanding that distinction protects us from two opposite mistakes. We do not need to deny animal emotion to recognize something unusual about human crying. And we do not need to invent an unsupported evolutionary story because the exact origin remains unknown. The responsible position is more patient. We can describe what tears do, study how people respond to them, compare possible functions, and admit where the evidence stops. That uncertainty is useful because it shows how science handles a real but incompletely recoverable question. Not by filling the missing past with certainty, but by allowing several explanations to remain open until evidence becomes stronger. The next time a human face becomes wet from emotion, the drops are ordinary because they come from a biological system built around the eye. And extraordinary because they can reveal attachment, memory, loss, relief, and meaning to another person, without a sentence being spoken. After everything we can measure about glands, nerves, faces, relationships, and social responses, one question still remains where it began. Why did evolution make human emotion visible through the eyes at all?